This is Trial Transcripts Exposed by Crime in Court with Heather. Raw courtroom reads with my commentary. Let's dive in. Hey everyone, welcome to Crime in Court with Heather. This is Trial Transcripts Exposed. We are reading through the Menendez Brothers retrial transcripts, and they are on trial for the murders of their parents, Kitty and Jose. We are hearing the defense's case right now, and it's interesting to have the transcripts because when we watched we watched trial one, we didn't have all the sidebars because they weren't necessarily all aired on, or at least not in the clips that we had. Some of them were cut out or whatever. So this is interesting because we are seeing all of the behind the scenes sidebars and arguments outside the presence of the jury and the things that the defense has to keep arguing just to try to defend their clients. So it's kind of getting ridiculous with all of the every little thing that they want to bring in, every witness that they want to bring in, it's a battle, it's a fight with this judge and the prosecutor. It seems like the prosecution and the judge are working in cahoots together because they seem to be on the same page 99% of the time. There's a few instances and occasions because of course he has to roll in the defense's side sometimes. And it's when it's ridiculous kind of objection from the state. But otherwise, usually the judge is ruling in favor of the state most of the time and blocking the defense from putting on a defense. We've seen this in Karen Reed. We've only witnessed it somewhat in the Delphi case in the pretrial stuff, but we didn't actually get to see it. We didn't get to see video of it, but we have transcripts of how she's treated the defense. We know how she's treated the defense. We see this time and time again where judges seem to be putting their hand a little bit more on the scale than they should be on one side and not the other. They're not supposed to do that. They're supposed to stay balanced. Well, anyways, with that in mind, let us get to today's presentation, which is a continuation of Dr. John Wilson, who has reviewed all of Erik's psychological evaluations and mental health materials. And I believe he's even interviewed him. He's interviewed some people about him. And he's testifying on hypervigilance, right? Or the conversation. He's testifying about a bunch of things when it comes to fear and your response to fear, especially repeated fear, PTSD, developing over repeated instances of, trauma. So with that being said, he's going to continue on talking about all of those things, including hypervigilance. Again, we're going to talk some more about that, which is near and dear to me because I have suffered from it. So before we do that, though, I do want to thank our founding Justice Insiders, and they are Toyota Girl 67, SLB 29488. May the force be with you, 4313. Jessica Wienand 6079. Mrs. Apples 2007, Butler 89833, Brooke JF, Jen P 773, Boom Chicka Wow Wow 1, and Kendall B 5757. Thank you all for being founding Justice Insiders. And you have until June 30th to join as a Justice Insider to gain that designation as a founding Justice Insider. After that, you will be a Justice Insider moving forward. No founding within your title. And you will be given the opportunity to have your name read on screen, just like I did today. All right. So thank you for all of my founding Justice Insiders for being here, for everyone for being here. Thank you. Let us get to our presentation today. We are beginning the day off with Friday, January 12th, 1996. So, the Honorable Judge Stanley Weisberg says, everyone is present. We'll have the jury out, please. The jury enters the courtroom. The court says, okay, the jury is in the jury box, ladies and gentlemen. Good morning. We're ready to resume with the testimony of the witness. I'll remind you, you're still under oath, and that is John P. Wilson. He returns to the stand, and the court says you may continue cross-examination, and Miss Abramson says, thank you, Your Honor. I just want to find in the mini version of the DSM-IV where we are, okay? I'm just going to wait a minute, Your Honor, while this shuffling back and forth stops. The court says, all right. Ms. Abramson says, thank you. We are talking about symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, and we are talking about, at the end of the day, yesterday, what's known as the D-cluster. Dr. Wilson, when practitioners in the mental health field talk about symptomology, that's part of the diseases and disorders listed in the DSM-III. Do you talk about them like the A cluster, the B cluster, the C cluster, the D cluster? Generally not. What do they usually How do they usually characterize these symptom categories? They talk specifically about the symptoms of them. They talk about the symptoms themselves rather than the cluster. So they're organized here to reflect what? Why are they separated out in these clusters? Dr. Wilson says they're separated into clusters to delineate the group that compromise the syndrome and to assist the clinician or the mental health professional in recognizing what are the different components of the disorder. We were talking about D-cluster. What aspect of the disorder is that? It reflects physiological arousal that wasn't present before the trauma. This specific aspect refers to changes in the somatic state or bodily state or reactive state so that the person after the trauma has been certain has certain sorry so the person after the trauma now has certain kind of physical reactions or bodily or somatic reactions that were not present before the trauma. And generally, there's an increase in the physical reactions. Does the body react to stress? Yes. Are there different symptoms in the body that react to stress? Yes. And do they do them all by themselves without a person having to say body react to stress? Yes. So they're involuntary. It's not like you say, hey, I want to react to this. Are they the product of thought? In other words, I'm thinking that I'm fearful now, and then the body reacts? It can be that way, yes. Appraisal can affect how intensely you respond. Generally speaking, in traumatic situations, the response of the body are automatic given the immensity of the traumatic stressor. Are the responses in all four bodies that are automatic? Yes. And we're talking about stress responses. Yes. Are there fear responses in our body that are absolutely automatic? We have no control over them? Yes, yes. Do they lead to sensations that we can experience? Yes. Give me an example, if you will, of let's say you're driving down the highway and a car or a truck is coming at you or a car cuts you off and you nearly have an accident. Is this a situation where the body automatically responds? Yes, it is. And in that situation that you just described, the most common response for people is to first and foremost feel overwhelmed by the suddenness of the event. That is, they didn't expect that car or truck to come into their field of vision or to potentially impact with their vehicle. The second response that normally happens to people is they find themselves, once the vehicle stops, that their heart is racing very rapidly. They're breathing more quickly than they were before this happened, and that's because there's a release in adrenaline in the body. It's preparing a fight or flight reflex, which is adaptive to the situation. Not to mention, if you know an accident's going to happen, you tense up, and then that's when your body hurts. That's when you get injuries. It was like a 4 or 5 car pileup. I was the last, no, I was the second to the first car in front. So I'm just sitting at a light. I'm still traumatized by this. And every time I drive past that one spot, I still think about it, and it makes me tense up. I was just sitting there waiting at a light. It was rush hour. I was going to a PetSmart, which was like totally out of my way in order to take care of some cats. I was like volunteering. And actually, I got into car accidents 2 times volunteering for these cats. And I was like, you know what? I'm done. So, anyways, the first time, neither of them were my fault. This first time, I'm just sitting there at the light and I hear screeching tires, and then you can hear the crash as it's like coming forward at you. And then all of a sudden, I see the car behind me coming at me, and then my whole body tensed up. I was injured, like back and stuff, nothing major or serious, but I was like sore for a couple days. But anyways, moral of the story, you do have bodily reactions when you're fearful. I was afraid my car was going to get hit, and then I hit the car in front of me too. That was scary. So my body reacted by, going into like clench mode, and then after it was over, my body was racing. I didn't have a panic attack, but probably could have come close. Anyways, sometimes as well, people find themselves feeling very dazed and find themselves confused and their head a little tingly. And that's because there's this very quick influx of blood to the large muscle cells. There's an activation of the nervous system to prepare to respond to the situation, and the person then finds themselves in this very tense reactive state, which may include fear or the kind of cognitive or thought process. Oh my God, I could have been killed. So afterwards, you start to lament what just happened. Now, in situations where a person is being physically threatened or believes they're being physically threatened, we're just talking here about an ordinary person, okay? A person with no pre existing trauma, no changes based on trauma, okay? Okay. So, a non traumatized ordinary person, for that person, if they're attacked or if they believe they're being attacked by another person, is there a similar set of automatic body responses? Yes. So there's fear responses, there's stress responses, and now there is a response to being attacked by another person, which is separate. They're all 3 separate kinds of responses. He says yes. The body responds in the same way to the stressful events, whether it's a personal attack or a catastrophic disaster, or being in warfare under fire. The body's reaction to traumatic stress is the same no matter what the stressor is. So, is there a particular system in the body specifically geared to dealing with the reacting to threats to the well being, threats to the survival of the organism? Yes, there is. Is that true in most animals that have been studied as well? Yes, it is. That they too have a separate system geared to survival? Yes. What is that system geared to survival called in human beings? The primary system is called the autonomic nervous system. It's part of the central nervous system, and it refers to the part of our body that controls nervous input, or what's referred to in technical term a sympathetic arousal, meaning that there's a part of the brain that governs how we deal with the input in the body. That's called the sympathetic nervous system, which is part of the automatic nervous system. I'm sorry, autonomic. I said it wrong. And then he says, or she asks, sorry, Miss Amerson asks, is it autonomic or automatic? He says it's autonomic, but it's also automatic. That's the system of the body that reacts biologically to the response of stress and trauma. So, people who have POTS, their autonomic system is out of whack. They can't cool themselves down when they're hot. They can't warm themselves up when they're cold. Just the opposite. They have a lot of like temperature fluctuations, differences in heartbeats, like your blood pressure drops. Your blood pressure has to increase to flow when you stand up and you feel like you're going to pass out. It's not a fun thing. But that is POTS is basically just your autonomic system not working properly. And now I'm finding out I didn't realize your autonomic system is when that goes out of whack, that's because of stress and trauma. So that makes sense because I talked about that a little bit in part 68 at the beginning. Kind of got a little passionate there. All right, so she continues, or he continues on, the witness says, but it's important to note that it also articulates with every other system in the body function as a whole. So the central nervous system is the brain. It's the governing system of all other systems of the body. But in terms of traumatic stress response, it's the primary system. The brain's encoding is the central nervous system, governing the autonomic nervous system, which controls the sympathetic nervous system, which governs our initial reactions to trauma and stress. So it's kind of a loop-de-loop to get there, but you get there. And the level of that reaction? The level of the reaction depends on the level of the stress, or to some extent. Well, okay, and that's with people who have not previously been traumatized. Sure. Let's talk. You mentioned something called fight or flight. Is this a part of the nervous system reaction that all animals who have been studied, including human beings, have? Yes. Explain, what is this a very primitive mechanism? In other words, is it one of the most primitive and earliest developed parts of the brain? Yes, it is. Is this directly geared to the survival of the organism? Yes. What is fight or flight? Fight or flight, very simply put, is when the body reacts to traumatic stress or stress in general, that it mobilizes two response tendencies. One of them, it mobilizes to respond. Is that what you mean? It mobilizes to respond, but that takes two tendencies. Okay. One of them is flee or to flight, that is to get away from the source of the stress or the threat. The other one is to stay and to confront or fight that stress or that threat. Is the choice of the pathway to fight or flee a conscious choice, or is it an automatic choice? Generally, it's an automatic choice. The person doesn't know why they reacted. For example, let me give you a hypothetical. Let's say a burglar is trying to kick in the door of your bedroom, okay? Would some people run out of the house and others run to the kitchen and grab a knife? Yes. It just depends on your level of trauma and your ability to think clearly, probably, in a traumatic situation. Is that something, does that differ between those who just, let's say this is terrifying. The person is terrorized, thinks about, thinks they're about to be killed by this unseen intruder in the middle of the night. Is the person thinking rationally and logically that it would be better if I ran out versus it would be better if I went to the kitchen and got a knife so I could stab the person in case they get through the door and don't have a gun, so they could shoot me first. Maybe the knife would do some good. Objection irrelevant and calls for speculation. The court says sustained as to the form of the question. You can do hypotheticals. She says, okay, if we're talking about the difference between behavior that stands and fights, how would you describe the process that determines which of those behaviors a person engages in generally? Generally speaking, and this is putting it in the simplest but clearest terms that I can, that there's an emotional overdrive. Bam. Erik and Lyle We're leading, or sorry, we're being led by their emotions. They go into an emotional overdrive when that fight or flight kicks in. He says, what I mean by that is the emotionality of the response tends to take over so that the person either is going to flee, flight, or they're going to stay and fight. Now, there are other things that affect whether they fight or flight, and that has to do with things like their prior history with similar kinds of experiences, whether or not they have the capacity to remain calm and tone down their emotional response. Like I said, the ability to remain calm. There are other things that can affect it, but starting at the primary level, it's an emotional overdrive that is the immediate biological response to the threat that is the first set of actions. And there's a difference between actions based on emotional overdrive than actions based on rational thinking? Yes. Now, does this D-cluster, in talking about difference in psychological symptoms, recognize some understanding or knowledge among the research and literature in this field that traumatized people have changed physiologically or biologically from from what they were pre-trauma? Correct. So there is a recognized understanding that people in this D-cluster have physiological and biological changes made in their chemical makeup. What is the nature of those changes? Without getting, let's not do a hormone by hormone. It's very technical, isn't it? It is. Rather than doing it hormone by hormone, generally, what are the differences, the changes that are undergone by people who have been traumatized enough to develop post traumatic stress disorder? The changes that occur are, and I'll try to make these very clear and simple, that the way the brain functions is often changed in post traumatic stress disorder. And the basic change is that the part of the brain that governs how we respond to stress after trauma is now in a changed state. That's something called neurotransmitters, which are chemicals in the brain. They're neurohormones that govern the way our brains function, tend to be altered. If I could use an analogy, it would simply be this. If you have a car and you have an idle screw that governs how the car revs at resting rate after the trauma, the idle screw has been changed. It's been turned up so that the car at rest now is going at a faster idle speed. What that means about post traumatic stress disorder is that after the person has developed the post traumatic stress disorder, the way they subsequently appraise additional trauma and stressors is now affected with the idle screw turned up. So they have an ongoing condition of a high idle speed. So you're always kind of like on edge. Whereas if you're not, you haven't been traumatized multiple times in your life, then you're not on this like, you're cool, you're chill, your vibe is chill. Whereas if you've been traumatized, sometimes it just takes once and you can be re-traumatized over and over again by it, or you can have multiple traumas in your life and just that's how you respond to trauma now because you've been dealt with it so many times. So you're just on an edge. You're like, oftentimes people who have been traumatized are very sensitive. They're very ready to, quick to anger, things of that nature. I've been there totally, so I get it. He continues on to say that they have what is technically called hyperarousal, meaning that their body tends to remain in a hyperaroused condition. That idle screw doesn't turn itself back down. That engine in the brain continues to have this high level of revolution, right? You're always like ready to go. You're ready to blow sometimes. People who have been traumatized, they can react very aggressively when um not talk I'll talk about this in a little bit, but I want to he's going into the hyper arousal, so I do want to talk about, oh my god, I just lost my page that I was on. Okay. So I can tell you for a fact that I am a highly sensitive person. This is an actual term, a psychological, a psychology term, where people take things, you can not just that you're emotionally sensitive, but your body, you're physically sensitive, you feel pain differently. Um, you notice things differently. There's clothing on your body rubbing you, or little noises in the background that are driving you crazy that, like, to the normal person, they don't hear them. But a person who's a highly sensitive person, it's different than hypervigilance, but hypervigilance is actually a symptom of highly sensitive people. So, I think I'm definitely a highly sensitive person. I think I have been my whole life, honestly, but it's an actual thing. So if you look into it, it's really cool. It's like, I can't remember the percentage, but it's something like the top, not top, but it's like 90% of the population in, like, all animal species are normal, right? They're not highly sensitive. And I'm making that statistic up. I can't remember what it is specifically, but like most people, they don't have this hypersensitivity. They're not hyper or highly sensitive people. They don't notice these things like I do. Then there's like this 10% in, like, all species that are hyper sensitive. They have hypervigilance. They are highly sensitive species, like a highly sensitive type of species of a human. I don't know how else to explain it. It's used basically for, like, survival of the fittest. These are things that, are, I know I'm not explaining it very well, but are it's been a while since I read this book, and which is what I wanted to share in the first place, is I read a book called The Highly Sensitive Person. It is written by Elaine N. Aaron, PhD. She's a psychologist, and um, it gives tips on how to thrive when you are a highly sensitive person. There was actually a documentary by Alanis Morissette about this, where she talked about she was a highly sensitive person, and people are, you are very understood. People don't understand you. People are not, sometimes they're afraid of you. They're afraid that you're going to be too sensitive about something, and it's a thing. So I'm just telling you that this is a thing. So when he starts talking about this hyper arousal and a highly sensitive person, I'm thinking in my mind too that he might be a highly sensitive person, not just that he's hyper aroused or has hypervigilance. Anyways, continuing on. That idol. Oh, again, if you wanted that book, it is The Highly Sensitive Person by Elaine N as in Nancy is her middle initial. Aron, Aron, is her last name, and she has a PhD. It's a bestseller. All right, so that idle screw doesn't turn itself back down. That engine in the brain continues to have this high level of revolution that the person can't simply shut down. That's the change. So that's what this D category is, supposed to measure the whole hyper aroused baseline, if you will, now in people who have PTSD. Objection leading. Ms. Aronson says people who have been traumatized. Objection leading. Overruled, says the court. The witness says yes. And just to take it one step further, but we'll get back to this a little bit later. If you have people who have been, let me strike that. Is this hyperarousal a condition that has been noted extensively in the literature for traumatized people, even those who have, uh, even those who don't have all three of the symptom clusters? So, is hyperarousal a condition that has been noted extensively in the literature for traumatized people, even those who don't have any of the three cluster or all three clusters? He says yes. Is it something that that has been noted in populations of battered women, even among those who only have battered person syndrome rather than PTSD? Yes. Has it been noted in populations of abused and molested children? Yes. And in other groups who have been traumatized but don't have that, strike that, is the distinctive difference between those who have PTSD and those who were otherwise damaged by trauma, the re experiencing requirements of PTSD. Yes. If you have people who have been traumatized by abuse, for example, but they don't have flashbacks or the intrusive thoughts or nightmares connected by the trauma or reliving of the trauma, but they've got everything else, are they still damaged by trauma? Yes. Can they be classified as battered persons rather than as persons with PTSD? Yes. Now, among those different groups of people, whether they have battered person syndrome or post traumatic stress disorder, is there in the literature support for the proposition that both groups, BPS, PTSD, the most common connection between them is the hyperarousal? Yes, certainly that's one of the connections. Others equally common as the hyperarousal? Yes. That's one of the standard connections. Yes, it is. When people who have been traumatized, you've indicated that this baseline, that what you say is the higher idle speed, I'm saying higher baseline, they're starting from a higher place as far as anxiety is concerned. Correct. And from a higher place as far as fears are concerned. Correct. You said they're at a higher place for appraising stress and trauma? Correct. Does what does that mean on the appraisal side of it? The appraisal means that after the traumatic experiences, the person may find themselves in other stressful situations. It may even be in another traumatic situation. Once they've been traumatized, the fact they're in this changed, more hyper-aroused state affects the way they evaluate subsequent experiences. So they're more likely to appraise another stressful situation as potentially more dangerous or potentially more traumatic or potentially more fearful. They may have a tendency to overact or to take protective measures of one type or other to make themselves feel more safe or comfortable. They may engage in behaviors to try to protect themselves. They may try to leave the situation, situate themselves in a particular location so they feel they're minimizing possibility of bad things happening to them. There's a whole range of things that people do. The point I'm making is it's that altered baseline or it's that turned up idle screw that's now influencing how they perceive and how they appraise what's happening in that next situation that's stressful for them, or what's happening in the world to determine whether things are dangerous or threatening. Yes. Is that a component of what you've called hypervigilance? Yes. Scanning. Is that scanning the environment for cues or clues that danger may be coming? Yes. And do traumatized people scan the environment and see things differently than non traumatized people? Yes. Do they tend to see danger where to non traumatized people, danger wouldn't appear to exist? They may see potential danger. Right. More so than a non traumatized person, he says. Especially if they're in. Well, what if we're talking about traumatized people who are still in the trauma causing environment? If they're still in the trauma, then they'll be in the most heightened state of arousal. Bam. If they're still in the trauma, they'll be in the most heightened state of arousal because there's no way to determine the potential for threat. Their response level tends to remain high all the time because they remain in an environment where the stressors are still there. So the potential for the harm, the potential for the threat, the potential for the traumatic injury continues to exist, and you feel like you have to walk on eggshells around your abuser when you're in that situation. So what that generally results in is the level of anxiety, the level of arousal remains at a very high level. Now, is there another phenomenon besides the fact that the idle screw is turned up and they're at this much higher level of arousal? Is another alteration that's been noted in the nervous system one that leads to an overreaction? In other words, when they do perceive what they think is a threat after scanning and react, are those reactions sometimes extreme in comparison to the actual level of threat? Yes. And is this a well understood phenomenon? Oh, the dog just kicked the laptop. Hold on. Look at him. He's upside down and his legs are in my face. That's okay. He wants belly rubs. And is this a well understood phenomenon? Yes. And are these extreme reactions coming from an overwhelming emotional feeling of the need to survive? Yes. Was it? Now, Dr. Wilson, that's manifested in behavior that can be observed. That's correct. Mr. Khan says objection leading, sustained, the answer stricken. Ms. Abramson says, is that manifested in a way that can be observed by other people? It is. How is that? Well, the external observer can see these things, behavior in a person, or they can see the behavior itself. They can see an example of hyperarousal, hypervigilance, or behaviors associated with the heightened state of arousal, such as an attempt to escape a room or to change one's position or to engage in one's other kind of activity that will indicate to the external observer. Hold on. Sorry about that. The dogs were barking at God knows what outside. I didn't see anything. To reiterate that sentence, go all the way back. Darn, it's a full length sentence. They can see an example of hyperarousal, hypervigilance, or behaviors associated with that heightened state of arousal, such as an attempt to escape a room or to change one's position or to engage in some other kind of activity that will indicate to the external observer something is going on with that person. They seem very uncomfortable. They seem distressed. They seem anxious. They seem to be acting in a way that's disproportionate to what's necessary to solve the problem. Ms. Aronson asks, when people with PTSD interact with the court system or find themselves within the criminal justice system, does that have any, statistically or looking over the scope of it, is there some trend about whether this aspect of the PTSD what this aspect does to people, brings people in contact with? Is there some trend about whether this aspect of what PTSD does to people brings people in contact with the criminal justice system? Objection, says Mr. Khan. The witness says yes. Mr. Khan says vague. The court says sustained. The answer stricken. Ms. Abramson says, would you explain based on your experience, and you've testified in many cases, have you not? Yes. For both sides? Yes. Would you explain? Well, strike that. Generally speaking, when you're testifying in a case in the criminal justice system, what has been the precipitating event or events that have brought people with PTSD in contact with the criminal justice system? I'm not sure what your question is. All right. You indicated that people with PTSD who perceive a threat overreact. Yes. Do they get involved in violent confrontations with other people? They can. Does that result in being arrested and prosecuted? Yes. And have you testified and have many other experts testified in cases where the overreaction is attributable to PTSD? Objection compound, says Mr. Khan. The court says sustained. Abramson says, have you testified in cases where the overreaction resulting in harm to another person is attributable to PTSD? Yes. And how is that? I mean, how is it attributed, PTSD? It's attributed to PTSD in a number of different ways. Actually, one is in terms of the hypervigilance and hyperarousal, where the person reacts to perceived threats, in some cases with aggression or with self-defense, or acts in an aggressive way on their appraisal of what's happening to them. So their immediate reaction is to be reactive, to respond aggressively to whatever's happening to them. It's a very common trait in people who have trauma in their lives. In other situations, persons with PTSD may have a flashback in which they misperceive the event or a cue or a situation and behave then as they did in a previous traumatic situation. For example, a Vietnam vet having a flashback and committing a crime believing he's in a war zone, when in fact he's not, would be an example of a flashback, PTSD related behavior leading to an act that's criminal. There are other ways as well. The third way, I'll just sketch briefly, and that is sometimes persons with PTSD are wanting to take their own life, and they have depression and tendencies to take their own life as part of the cluster of the post traumatic stress. And in these cases, the person may act in a way as to create a situation in which they get themselves killed. So, in effect, they set up their own death, their own. It's like when you say cop by, it's kind of like that, but you're doing it, in other ways by being aggressive and putting yourself in dangerous situations. In so doing, they may not succeed and end up in criminal activity. So there are a variety of ways in which this can happen, ranging from hypervigilant response and misperceiving cues leading to aggressive behavior. The flashback episodes to a dissociative or depressive or wanting to take your own life ideations, types of wishes that lead the person to behaviors that may fail in terms of the wanting to take your own life wish, but end up in a criminal situation. So you might get into a dangerous situation because you think that, you're not going to survive it, but then you do, and then you've got criminal charges. Next question from Ms. Abramson. She says, in situations where a person who has been traumatized and whether they have just the battered person cluster of symptoms or the PTSD cluster of symptoms, if they're still in the traumatic environment and they perceive that there's going to be a repetition of the trauma or that they perceive a threat from a cue in the environment, we'll strike that. That's making it too complicated. Can be a combination of people overreacting, people with PTSD overreacting to a cue where they think they're about to be traumatized against or killed that has features of prior trauma. So it's got both the basic overreaction that's observed in people with PTSD and some components of re-experiencing. Does that happen? Mr. Khan says, I would object as irrelevant unless it's case specific. Ms. Abramson says, well, get there, or we'll get there. The court says overruled. You can answer the question. The witness says the answer is yes. Ms. Abramson says, is that what you believed happened here? Yes. Let's go back now to these symptoms of increased arousal. I think we've already talked about the difficulty in concentrating. Yes. And you indicated that there was information based on observations or observations of teachers over the course of Erik Menendez's education that reflected repeated difficulty in concentrating. That's correct. Did this information from third parties, teachers, and others persist all the way through his 18th year, even in the month or 2 months before the homicides? Was that kind of behavior ever reported? Yes. Now, have you been given and have you examined, strike that? You testified you saw all the school records as far as you know of all the schools that Erik Menendez ever attended? Correct. Can you sit? No? Okay. He's not sitting. He just wants to get in my face. There are even some records of UCLA and Berkeley schools that he didn't attend. Schools he didn't attend. That's correct. Was there one school that he attended very briefly, a school for the learning disabled, in fact? Yes, it was called the Lewis School. And were there records that indicated attendance at that school for 4 weeks in the summer of 1986? That's correct. He had to go to summer school. And are there reports of partial testing that was done on Erik Menendez ostensibly for learning skills, learning disabilities, learning abilities? Yes, there are those records. And is there information that there indicates that he did suffer from 3 or 4 different learning disabilities? Objection calls for hearsay, no foundation, irrelevant. Evidence Code, Section 352. The court says, all right, we'll hear about that with a discussion with counsel. Do you want to do it now or to go to something else? She says, let me ask another question about this, Your Honor, before we do that. He says, all right. Ms. Abramson says, was the information contained in the records from the Lewis School important to you in making your assessment of whether Erik Menendez suffered from PTSD disorder as early as 1986? Yes. You've indicated that post-traumatic stress disorder was codified in the DSM-IV in 1980 with respect DSM-III in 1980. Yes, 1980 DSM-III. You said 4. I don't think I said DSM. Oh, okay. The DSM-III came out, which further refined the definition, right? Was PTSD in children, did the learning curve in this research community on that, was that slower? Did it take a little while or a while after 1980 before there was ample research dealing with PTSD in children? Objection irrelevant. Sustained, says the court. Ms. Abramson says, based on the research, was there a common misdiagnosis of children with PTSD back in the 1980s before PTSD was widely researched with respect to children? Objection irrelevant. The court says, let's just move on a little bit more into the specifics of this case. Ms. Abramson says, I'm trying to get there. Court says, I understand that. Well, let's do it. Ms. Abramson says, well, were there evaluations of Erik Menendez that suggested that he suffered from attention deficit disorder and hyperactivity as a child? Yes. Is attention deficit disorder and hyperactivity a common misdiagnosis for childhood PTSD? Yes. Now, we have talked yesterday briefly about the pervasive anxiety of PTSD. Yes. Was there, first of all, I want to ask you about 2 teachers from Princeton Day School. Did you read the testimony, see the testimony, read the statement, and see the school records prepared by Sandra Sharp, Erik Menendez's 9th grade Spanish teacher? Yes. Did you similarly read the testimony, view the testimony, read the statement, and read the written school records of Erik Menendez's 9th grade English teacher, Barbara Howarth? Yes. And did both of those teachers observe behaviors in on Erik's part that led you to conclude that he had heightened state of anxiety? Yes. Could you just briefly just tell us what those behaviors were that both of them observed? There was a number of behaviors that both of the teachers observed during the 9th grade year. He had problems with concentration, he had problems with attention. He had organization difficulties in terms of organizing his schoolwork, completing tasks, getting them done in the proper fashion and on time. There were problems with him concentrating in the classroom, periods of time when he would appear to drift off. Those are the most consistent observations throughout the year by both teachers. Well, what about with respect to fear and anxiety on his part? Did they each see a manifestation of that? Yes. And what was it that they saw? The specific manifestations that both of the teachers saw was that Erik would cry prior to a quiz and he would cry following the completion of a test or a quiz when his grade was passed back. This was consistent throughout the year and it pertained both to pre and post test taking attitudes. So he was probably crying because he knew he would be in trouble for getting a low score. That is, he not only cried but appeared very fearful about his performance on the tests. how well he was going to do, how well he actually did when the tests were handed back. And did both of those teachers find that extremely unusual for someone his age? In fact, they said exactly that given his age and their experience, that it was highly unusual for a 15-year-old boy to manifest the level of crying and fear that he did throughout the period of the year. Was this crying done in private or was he doing it right in class in front of the other students? It was done in class in front of the other students. Okay, now getting back to the D cluster, I think when we talked about difficulty in concentrating, the next category is something we've been talking about, which is hypervigilance. Yes. Is hypervigilance considered a common or an uncommon characteristic of battered person syndrome? It's common. Is it considered a common or an uncommon component of post traumatic stress disorder? Common. And you've described to some extent what hypervigilance is by way of behavior, and is it also something that's caused by this heightened arousal of the nervous system? Yes. I think we have I may approach if I may approach your honor so I can read this. I can't see it. Okay. Now, this little chart here, which was numbered 393, everything has categories here. It has 4 categories. All of these are aspects of hypervigilance. That's correct. And what is the first one? Cognitive. What does cognitive mean? Cognitive pertains to perception, to memory, to reasoning, to thinking, generally higher order mental processes. Are cognitive processes that this person is aware they're having? Yes. So these are thoughts then they're having? Yes. This isn't the automatic part of the body? No, this is the higher brain function. The person is aware, they're thinking, they're having thoughts about something. They may be reflecting upon things. They may be very much aware of what it is that they're focusing on as they scan and perceive the environment. And the cognitive, or the aspects of hypervigilance that are classified as cognitive, is what? Well, the two on the chart are scanning of the environment, and the second one is faster perception of recognition of threat. Are people that are hypervigilant capable of correctly assessing potential threat? Mr. Khan says objection irrelevant as to its non-case specific. How is that non-case specific? Because he's saying that Erik has hypervigilance. The court correctly overrules that. The witness says yes. So remember, the question was, are people that are hypervigilant capable of correctly assessing potential danger? His answer is yes. Ms. Abramson says, and are they also capable of because of their heightened fear state to misperceive cues as threats when there is no real threat? So to blow something up bigger out of proportion than it actually is. So if you see your dad and mom go into the dining room or the den and close the door, to you that is like, even though that's something they would normally possibly do, but you're in this heightened state of awareness right now and hypervigilance, like overload. So you'd perceive it to be a dangerous act that your father and your mother are in this room and they're plotting against you. You become paranoid about that. So Ms. Abramson says, and are they also capable or prone because of their heightened fear state to misperceive cues as threats when there is no real threat? The witness agrees, yes. Next question. Both of those are a function of the cognitive aspect of hypervigilance? Correct. And what is the second aspect of hypervigilance? Affective. Would you define what the word affective means? Emotional. That's easy. And what Mr. Khan says, objection, motion to strike, counsel's comment. And court says, let's not have comments on the answers. Just another question, please. He didn't need to strike it. That was stupid. It's just like casual conversation that she said it. I noted she probably shouldn't have said it, but whatever. Miss Abramson says, What's what are the four emotional or affective aspects of hypervigilance? The witness states the four listed on the chart are anxiety, fear, terror, and increased arousal of the nervous system. And the increased arousal of the nervous system here is that does the nervous system get aroused both automatically and as a consequence of thought? Yes. Is this part here, this arousal, what happens after thought? It can happen as an afterthought or it can happen automatically. Well, isn't the somatic part of the automatic part on this chart? The witness says if you want to separate it that way, they're all interrelated, of course. She says, I know, just to define. He says, yes. Okay, so what's the third aspect of hypervigilance? Somatic. By the way, is the chart accurate in listing the aspects of hypervigilance? Yes. You have said what's on this chart. Is there something that's missing? We can put it on. He says, no, this is a fine summary of hypervigilance. Okay. And the third category of aspects of hypervigilance is called somatic? Yes. What's a one word definition for somatic? Body. And what are the three components of the body aspect of hypervigilance? Increased physical tension, increased heart rate, respiration, etc., and increased autonomic nervous system arousal. And that's what we talked about? Yes. And what's the fourth component or aspect of hypervigilance? The fourth component is the behavioral response, the behavior action. And it says on the chart responses and actions to deal with fear and anxiety. Is it talking about particular types of responses and actions or particular levels or what? Both. It's particular types of responses as well as particular levels or intensity of the reaction. I think my question is there a typical behavior of hypervigilant people? A typical behavior a typical behavior really is first and foremost the scanning, the looking at the environment to find are there cues that signal threat or danger to me. That really is the first orienting point with hypervigilance. Is that what you were describing? What outward behavior indicating hypervigilance among those people who are involved in the hotel fire? Yes. So that now being in a hotel causes all this activity and behavior? Yes. Did those people also report being fearful? Ugh, he's on my arm now. I can't scroll. Yes. Now, when the trauma is caused by another human being, and if hypervigilance is a characteristic now of a trauma of a person and they're in contact with or in proximity with a person or persons who have caused this trauma is part of the environment that is scanned, that trauma abusing person, their abuser, let us say, and every aspect of that abuser. Yes. Objection calls for speculation. Sustained, answer stricken. Ms. Abramson says in the literature, or battered persons, particularly battered women, other people battered in domestic relationships. Okay, this is driving me nuts, dog. Here's your bone. Eat the bone. Stop playing with my earbuds. In the literature of battered persons, particularly battered women, other people battered in domestic relationships with people they know and are around and abuse children, does the literature indicate an extremely high level of attention by the victims of abuse to the moods, behaviors, looks, voice, gestures of their abuser? Yes, I can attest to this in adulthood, not as a child, but in adulthood. my ex, when he would constantly get angry at me, like, then I'd be angry. We'd all be angry. The whole house, we'd be not in a good mood. So it's very possible that um, you can also absorb like their moods and stuff. So when they're, you pay very close attention to their behaviors and their traits and all of that, and then you're looking for any moment that they might blow up at you. So you walk on eggshells and you try really hard not to have them blow up at you. So that's a big part of what hypervigilance is. Mr. Khan objects, says it's compound and irrelevant. Evidence Code Section 352. The court says overruled. The answer will stand. The witness says the answer is yes. Ms. Abramson says, and did you make a determination in the case? Did you determine an opinion in this case that Erik Menendez was hypervigilant? Objection, leading. Overruled. I can ask it non-leading, says Ms. Abramson. The court says okay, it would be the same question, so overruled. The witness says the answer is yes. Um, Ms. Abramson says, and did you form any opinion whether or not a focus of his hypervigilance was the behaviors, moods, movements, words, gestures, facial expressions? The court says, now that is rather leading, so let's rephrase it. Ms. Emerson says, let's do this. Did you form an opinion as to whether he was hypervigilant about his parents? Yes. What aspect of his parents, and if it's different for each one, you can separate them. Was he hypervigilant? What was he hypervigilant about? Let me start with the father. Okay, says Miss Abramson. He was hypervigilant about a number of aspects. Mr. Khan says, objection, vaguest of time. Sustained. Miss Abramson says, we're talking about, well, first of all, did the hypervigilance about his father from the onset of the sexual molestation to the moment of the homicides change? No. So you're always hypervigilant. You're never not hypervigilant. Your level of hypervigilance could increase or decrease, but it's always kind of there. Then pick a time. Pick the week of the homicides, okay? He says, start with the father. The week of the homicide, he was hypervigilant to a number of aspects of the father's behavior: the level of his voice, his body posture, his gait, how he walked, whether he walked slowly or quickly. He was hypervigilant to how he came home to the house, how he came in the door, whether it was rapidly or slowly, how he closed the door to the car, whether it was soft closing or the car door, or whether it was a slam. He was hypervigilant to very specific cues. For example, whether his suit coat was being carried over his shoulder or was on his body. He was hypervigilant to his voice level, how he greeted his wife, whether the voice sounds angry or nice. He was hypervigilant to whether or not he came upstairs. He was hypervigilant to the speed at which he came up the stairs. He was hypervigilant to the directionality of his father's actions when he came upstairs, whether it would turn left, whether he would turn left or right. He was hypervigilant to his face. He was hypervigilant to his eyes, in particular, whether he had particularly strong gaze, which he characterized as a fierce gaze, or whether it was a soft or nicer gaze. He was hypervigilant to other cues in his father as well, whether he would be more relaxed and take some time coming in the house, or whether he had a strong sense of urgency. He was hypervigilant to certain things, such as whether or not he would ask Mr. Menendez to go to his room and tell him he would be there in a minute. There were a number of other kinds of very specific behaviors that were stimulants or cues from Mr. Menendez to which he was hypervigilant. What were the cues, if anything, related to historically? Historically, they were related to a number of things, specifically to the probability of the onset of the sexual molestation. They may also have been related to whether or not they would be punished or loved. They would also be related to whether he might be disciplined, such as being beaten with a belt or not. They were also a cause as to whether or not he may have a positive interaction with his father, a kind of less abusive interaction, one that was more loving in his perception. These cues related to both potential threat, sexual molestation, punishment, discipline, and to, I would say, to a lesser degree, cues as to when there might be a more loving and positive interaction with his father. Now, did these cues, these specific things about his father, that he would scan for, did they originate? I mean, where did they? Were there some observations of his father where these cues originated? In other words, specific things his father would do or how he'd look or walked that led to something else. Yes, these were learned. So it's all learned. It's all from perceiving him in that way in the past and then having something traumatic happen because of, you know, the way that he was acting, that his Jose's behavior, his mood, his everything. My question is, what difference did it make, for example, if his father had his suit coat over his shoulder or not? What was that connected to? Yes, that was connected to the fact that his father was in a nice mood, a good mood, and it meant that he was unlikely to experience sexual molestation on that night. If a door was slammed, what did that cue to you? Cue to? In general, anger. Anger cues meant sexual molestation. And if his father had a certain look in his eyes, what would that cue to? It would cue a number of things. It could cue sexual molestation. It specifically, at a given point in his past, could cue fear of rough sex, or it similarly could cue the threat of punishment with the belt for a violation or infraction of something that might have taken place during the day that could have been reported by his mother. Were there also cues based on whether his father was using a particular tone of voice? Yes. And what did the tone of voice relate to? A pressure tone of voice, an angry voice, rapidly speaking rapidly with anger was a cue that suggested molestation. Was there also words that were cued by themselves in the way Erik scanned the environment of his father? Yes. And was there any significance to his father saying, "Go to your room, I'll be right there"? Yes. Was that significant before August 20th, 1989? Yes. What did that signify? That the father would come to the room and there would be sexual molestation. For an ordinary person, if a father said to a child, "Go to your room, I'll be there in a minute," does that mean anything more than to go to, coming? No. And if Jose had said that in the past and ordered Erik to his room and after that molested Erik, did that mean necessarily that anytime Jose Menendez said to Erik, "Go to your room," he was going to molest him? No, not every single time. Would it mean it to outsiders? No. With respect to Erik Menendez, however, why did this thing become, well, strike that. In your opinion, when he heard these words, did something automatically flow from him from that? Did something automatically flow from that to him? It's a weird way to say it. Yes. What was that? What automatically flowed to him was that his father was going to come to his room and that there would be sexual molestation or another adversive or unpleasant experience, maybe just a punishment or of some sort. He mostly doled out, you know, physical, violent punishments, or even had Erik hitting himself, punishing himself, inflicting pain on himself in some ways. Did he claim that he had never had any experiences of his father being in his room other than adverse or adversive or unpleasant ones? No. Then why is this cue? I think you've indicated cues indicate always that the trauma is going to happen. Yes. Why does he see this as a cue that the trauma is going to happen, even if the trauma didn't always happen this way? Because most of the time there was a connection between that particular kind of cue and what happened afterwards. There was a learned connection. The probabilities were, to say it simply, when certain cues were present: angry voice, fast gait, loud talking, rapid steps, that in his experience, what followed when those cues were present in his father is sexual molestation. Sorry, I have to readjust because the dog is like right where my hand needs to be for the mouse. So I'm struggling to do anything here. All right, so would you characterize it as reasonable or unreasonable for someone who has been traumatized in a certain way with a certain set of behaviors, when that same set of behaviors is presented to him, to make an assumption he may be traumatized again? Objection, irrelevant, improper. The court says objection sustained. Abramson says, with the Vietnam War vets that you have studied, they weren't traumatized every single day of the war, were they? Some were. Not all of them were. Very few were traumatized every single day. With respect to the ones that were not traumatized every day, do they still have a cue that anything that reminds them of Vietnam, even a day when they weren't traumatized, generates their emotional and psychological and physiological responses? When they were in Vietnam or afterwards? Afterwards? Yes. So that Huey helicopter doesn't, that the Vietnam driving down the street, if he sees a Huey, the court says, we've been through all this. Let's go on to something else. He says, I understand that. Let's focus on the issues in the case and not the Vietnam War. It's an example so that the jury can better understand. And it's not for Judge Weisberg to understand, where he says, I understand that. It's not for him to understand, it's for the jury to understand. So everything that they're putting on as evidence is for the jury, not for him. Miss Abramson says, we'll get there, Judge. Now, is there any other aspect of hypervigilance with respect to either traumatized people in general or Erik Menendez in particular, before we get to the factual connection later, but anything about what hypervigilance means or how he experienced it that's significant? That's the compound question. Well, let me back up. I'm sorry. You described the cues from the father that Erik had scanned for over the course of years of his life, correct? Correct. What about the mother? Were there cues that of the mother that he had scanned? Yes. Now, he didn't claim that his mother had sexually molested him, did he? No. Were there traumas, however, associated with his mother? Yes. And what were the nature of those traumas associated with the mother? The nature of the trauma were several. One was that he tended to drive very recklessly. Objection irrelevant, motion to strike, evidence code, section 352. The court says okay. Objection sustained to the form of the question. What were the nature of the traumas associated with his mother? That was the question. Why is that the form of the question? Anyways, Ms. Abramson says, I'm not asking for specifics. The court says the answer is stricken. She says, let me back up a bit. Was Erik Menendez, in your opinion, hypervigilant about his mother as well as his father? Yes. Were there behaviors on their part that he believed were cues to harm or potential harm from her? Yes. Without getting into the specifics of this point, generally speaking, well, strike that, let me back up. Apart from the sexual molestation, were there other traumas and trauma-inducing behaviors that Jose Menendez participated in inflicting trauma on Erik Menendez? Yes. And were there traumatic behaviors that both parents participated in together that were traumatic and caused injury, traumatic stress injury to Erik Menendez? Yes. Were there behaviors by the mother individually that were traumatic and caused traumatic stress injuries to Erik Menendez? Yes. If you can just, first of all, are there some forms of psychological abuse or something that's called psychological maltreatment? Are there some forms of that that are traumatic? Yes. Even in the absence of accompanying physical abuse? Yes. Is there a particular category in the way psychological abuse is characterized that is especially traumatic? Yes. And what is that category called? Objection irrelevant. Evidence Code Section 352. Overruled. The witness says the category is called terrorizing behaviors. Abramson says, and were there a series of behaviors? Strike that. Were there patterns of terrorizing behaviors engaged in by both Menendez parents over the entire course of Erik Menendez's life? Objection irrelevant. Evidence Code Section 352. Court says overruled, but we'll take our recess before we have an answer, and I'll discuss the issue with counsel. Don't discuss the matter with anyone, and don't form any final opinions about it. We'll resume in 20 minutes. Sorry. So the jury leaves the courtroom, and we're gonna have a bit of some arguments here without the presence of the jury. The court says, "Okay, what is it that you propose to elicit?" Ms. Abramson says, Conscious, conscious efforts to frighten without getting into the specifics. I mean, Erik testified about some of these. The court said Erik Menendez has testified to specific acts. If you confine yourself to those acts, I'll overrule the objection. If you go beyond that to other hearsay material that's obtained from others, then I'll sustain the objection. Ms. Abramson says, no, I was going to stay pretty much within the scope of what he was saying, or what he said, having described as terrorizing and traumatic. Court says, if that's what we've heard from the defendant in his testimony that you presented to the court as the basis for asking those questions and the rulings of the court, then I'll permit those. Ms. Abramson says, let me do this. Let me scan my list of terrorizing things. Court says, you can do that. Samerson says, if there's anything different that is independent, I'll bring to the court's attention before I ask it. Court says you are to refrain from asking any questions of the witness, and the witness is not to give any answers that deal with the subject of what is or is not reasonable. He is not the person to decide what conduct is or is not reasonable to him. If that issue ever goes to the jury, it's unclear if that issue would ever go to the jury at this point. My feeling is it probably won't. That if it goes to the jury ever, that's the province of the jury to decide what is reasonable and unreasonable. Ms. Aronson says, I wasn't asking about reasonable or unreasonable with respect to the specific issues in this case. I was asking in general sense whether it's a function of reason or not reason. Court says the way you phrased it and the way the answer was to be given would clearly relate to the facts of this case, which would invade the province of the jury. It doesn't require any expertise. All right, we'll take a recess. And then they do. That's a long recess. They took a 35-minute recess. Following proceedings were held in court outside the presence of the jury. So they're back, but still no jury. Ms. Amerson says, Your Honor, it's my understanding we're only going to noon. The court says we have a juror who has taken ill and is able to hold out until noon. Ms. Amerson says he is able to hold out. The court says yes. Do we have anything you wanted to discuss in regard to the last issue that we had dealt with? Ms. Abramson says, no, I think that I understand the court's rule about, well, let me ask this. Let me just inquire of the court the following. It is significant to Dr. Wilson's assessment here that the general environment in this house is one of the parental tyranny. Whether he uses that word or not, that is the very authoritarian, domineering, and fear inducing environment. That's crucial. I would like to be able to bring that out just that way, that environment. I recognize the court has placed limits on recitation of special acts, so I'm not going to go into obviously all of the acts that would prove that up because there's hundreds of them. I just want to say that that's the setting in which specific individual terrorizing things are done and specific sexual traumas occur. That's what I would like to do. So the court understands the roadmap, and I'm asking leave of court to do that. Court says, well, I don't know exactly what you're responding to do, or what you're proposing to do, sorry. Samerson says, I want him to characterize the family environment. Court says, in just a general sense? Samerson says, yes. Court says, the way you just did. Samerson says, those are my words, not his, but in a general sense. Court says this relates to his opinions in regard to the mental state of the defendant, Erik Menendez, at the time of the shooting. Ms. Amerson says, yes, it does, Your Honor, because it indicates why his post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms are so extreme to bring about the extreme reaction that they did. And it has to do with trauma in an environment of generalized fear and tyranny, so that he's overreacting because of the lifelong high anxiety state caused by a combination of specific trauma and tyrannical background. Court says, all right. People wish to be heard? No, says Mr. Khan. Court says, all right. I'll permit that general characterization with the understanding that other than those instances that have already been ruled admissible, the court does not expect recitation of anything else. Ms. Amerson says, I think there's only one other thing, and it's only because I don't recall whether or not Erik Menendez did testify to this, but Dr. Wilson does find it significant that from a very early age and continuing, and corroborated by many people, Erik Menendez was consistently frightened driving with his mother because she drove so recklessly and so dangerously. And it starts at the age of 2 when he's observed by other people in her car without a seatbelt, without a car seat, hanging on to a strap. It persists throughout his before he can drive himself, that he drives in ways that are very endangering, and that's very frightening to him and to anyone who drives with her. And I don't know if he was permitted to testify about that, but it's something that Dr. Wilson finds significant in that. I don't know, maybe a dozen witnesses corroborate at all the ages, all different ages. The court says, all right, to the extent that this is material that was related to him by the defendant, he can refer to it. But as to what other people might or might not have said on that subject, it's hearsay. Ms. Amerson says, no, no, Judge. We're not going to bring out the specifics of what was said, just that this was her behavior. The court says, or that other people have. Or that other people have described it. It's still a conclusion as to what other people described. Miss Abramson says, I'm not going to refer to other people, just that she drove recklessly and dangerously. Court says, as described by the defendant? Miss Abramson says, he's not going to characterize who is describing it. The court says people wish to be heard on that. Mr. Khan says, yes, the defendant did not testify to that fact, and I don't recall reading that in Dr. Wilson's notes, so it was not the defendant who described it. The defendant fully explained to the jury why he was fearful of his father, and that was never mentioned. Ms. Abramson says it was objected to. Mr. Khan says, I don't think at this point that should be admitted. The court says yes. I don't recall if it was testified to by the defendant, but again, this would be limited to whatever the defendant told the witness, not what others described as to the mother's driving behavior. It's irrelevant. Ms. Abramson says it's what the defendant told the witness. It's also what the defendant told Dr. Vickery, whose notes this witness has been. The court does, and again, we're talking basically about information from the defendant, not from others, and it would be received just to reflect part of the basis of the witness's opinion as to the state of mind, the mental state of the defendant at the time of the killings. Mr. Emerson says, but Judge, at some point, I'm going to be asking Dr. Wilson about the things he relied on and whether in making an assessment he does depend exclusively and solely on the report of the patient. Now, as the court knows, that is not appropriate methodology and that will be subject to challenge and just a few quick questions by the prosecution. I think at some point we would be entitled to know that Dr. Wilson's methods is to try to corroborate through the state of other people as much as possible any and all facts that a patient he's evaluating gives him so that it doesn't sound like it's all Erik Menendez's credibility and nobody else's because he'll be attacked. Dr. Wilson will be attacked for lying on that. Court says, at this point, we're dealing with the issue bearing in mind that the court has already reviewed offers of proof by the defense as to which witnesses you have proposed to call. Court is also aware of the evidence introduced during the first trial and is reviewing all of the material and the objections relating to the specific instances described by his witnesses with a view of Section 352 of the Evidence Code, balancing whatever probative value there might be to this evidence with the potential for confusion of issues and undue consumption of time and undue prejudice. And although an expert is permitted to recite certain hearsay material for the purpose of establishing the basis for his opinion, that is subject to the court's discretion, and if certain evidence is excluded by exercise of that discretion, that does not mean that thereafter the evidence is independently admissible by testimony of such witnesses. Ms. Amerson says, I know. The court says, so at this point, the court is exercising its discretion to limit the scope of the examination of what is relevant and probative and not duly time consuming or prejudicial or confusing of issues. All right, so we haven't got to the issues that you're talking about yet. So let's get the jury out. Jury comes out and we begin, or we will resume shortly, cross-examination. The court says, okay, the jury is back, and I do understand one of you is feeling ill today. And I appreciate the fact that you're able to stick it out until noon, and we'll be breaking at that point so that you can get a good start on a recuperation for the weekend and be back next week. Remember, this is Friday. And he says, and it's been a tough go for us all here. Every time we turn around, someone else gets sick. And it's tough, and I appreciate the fortitude all of you have shown in keeping going. That's a weird way to word it, but okay. Okay, you may resume your examination, he says to Miss Abramson, and she says, thank you very much, Your Honor. Dr. Wilson, we were talking about the cue reading tendency of hypervigilance and cues flowing from past traumas. Do you recall that? That's correct. And we were specifically talking about a form of psychological maltreatment that's characterized as terrorizing. Correct. Now, terrorizing is that term, as that term is used in psychological maltreatment, does that mean life threatening? It can mean that. Does it always mean instantly life threatening? No. Can environments in homes, for example, be terrorizing even though it doesn't consist of a moment to moment life threatening behavior by the caretakers of that home? Yes. And in determining this case, with respect to Erik Menendez and the type of symptoms of post traumatic stress disorder that, in your opinion, he suffers, was it important for your. Sorry. He just always has to sit on me, and I can't. Sit out of my hair. I couldn't get it up. Sorry. Um, in determining this case, Ms. Abramson asks, with respect to Erik Menendez and the type of symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder that, in your opinion, he suffers, was it important for your assessment to look at the entire home environment in which the specific traumatic behaviors were occurring? Yes. Why? Why is the surrounding environment significant? The surrounding environment is significant because one of the things that I want to look at is the degree to which there may be support or buffers or cushions to the specific types of traumatic events that occur in the context of a family, or in terms of traumatic stress more generally that could occur outside the family. Really, the issue comes down to how much nutrient, nutrient, nurturance, can't say the word, sorry. How much nurturance, how much support, how much outlet or buffers or other factors are in the context of the family that can kind of offset the counterbalance when there's a traumatic impact. So that's the significance of it. So, are these differences in, well, first of all, is the whole subject of incest families something that has been studied by researchers and clinicians in the area of child sexual abuse? Yes, it is. And have the dynamics of incest families been studied? Yes. Does every child who is the victim of incest develop post traumatic stress disorder? No. Are these some mental illnesses even more severe? Or are there some more mental illnesses even more severe? I mean, are there some actual mental illnesses that are very severe that can flow from incest? Yes. And are these some victims of incest who don't develop any mental disease, defect, or disorder? Yes. Does the surrounding environment, the dynamic of the incest family, contribute to whether or not a child who's being sexually molested in the home does or doesn't develop traumatic symptoms of damage? Yes. Did you make a strike that? Did you form the opinion as to whether or not the environment in this home was more likely to lead to traumatic symptoms and high degree of traumatic symptoms versus less likely? Yes, I did. And what was your opinion on that? More likely. And what were the factors that led to that opinion? There were several factors that led to that opinion. First and foremost is this is a paternalistic family. The father was a authoritarian, dominating, controlling, tyrannical, threatening, and rarely used rewards, positive affirmation, positive confirmation, nurturing acts, or acts of kindness that were developmentally or otherwise appropriate in caring for children. His basic posture towards his children was that of threat with high expectation as well for performance. His behavior was fear inducing, anxiety producing, tear inducing in this family. The mother, likewise, also was hostile, cold, unavailable, herself threatening, and also unpredictable and erratic in her behavior, unstable, non nurturing, non affectionate, non intervening, non supportive of her children, including specific instances of which it would be warranted for her to intervene on behalf of her children where there are acts perpetrated against the children that were harmful, dangerous, destructive, injurious, and psychologically terrorizing. So the combination of the father's power, authoritarianism, and threats, punishments without rewards, and the unavailability of a mother to nurture, contravene, and support the boys created a milieu that would exacerbate any negative traumatic experience or any highly stressful experiment within the fabric and context of that family. That's powerful. Those are powerful words. So not only would Jose and his way and how he took control over the whole family, and he was the authoritarian, and even Kitty followed what he ordered, so he was the lead in their little four-person unit. So that alone, the way that he treated the boys probably would have caused traumatic effects to this PTSD, as he's trying to explain, or hypervigilance or any of the symptoms from PTSD. And he's also trying to explain on top of that, he also has a mother who's not nurturing, a mother who doesn't help when he's in trouble or when times are dangerous. He actually, or she actually, had put him in danger many times as a small child when, like, they would be grocery shopping and she would just leave his side and he would get scared and couldn't find his mom, or driving erratically and dangerously all the time with the kids in the car when they were young. She would do that. And that was testified to. So the combination of the two parents, they had no chance basically to not be traumatized in this home, pretty much is what this doctor is saying. Did the mother engage in self fear inducing and fear causing behaviors? Yes. Did she engage in such behaviors over the course of Erik Menendez's developmental years? Yes. What are the developmental years for a child? Well, the developmental years really start at birth and continue through adolescence. So 18? Correct. And during all that time, the person is still considered developing their adult person. Well, they're developing their childhood person and their adolescent person, and then eventually transitioning into their adult development. Is there a common accepted notion of when a person actually is developed as an adult? Generally, in the developmental literature, we think about the emergence of adulthood in late adolescence, in the very late teen years, 17, 18, 19, transitional years, psychologically, between the formative experiences of childhood and adolescence and the emergence into adulthood and adult responsibilities. So, are you wholly formed as an adult by 19? No. And when we talk about child development into these stages, are we talking about each and every child, or are we talking about children raised in a positive environment? I'm not sure what your question is, he says. She says, okay, are there things in the environment of a child's life that can interfere with their development? Of course. That can interfere with their maturing? Yes. That can interfere with their emotional maturity? Yes. That can interfere with tasks, developmental tasks, particularly those involving independence and self reliance and self confidence, self image. Are those things that are supposed to develop in children over certain stages of their children and childhood and teens? Yes. Objection leading and compound. The court says sustained. The answer is stricken. Sorry, I didn't know if you could hear that. We have people on our roof today working, so there's some banging going on. So apologize if you hear that. So let's keep going. It seems to be quieter now. Mr. Khan says objection, and the answer stained. Ms. Abramson says, well, what are the things that are supposed to be developed by the late teens with respect to maturity type issues? Objection, irrelevant under Evidence Code Section 352. Sustained, says the court. Miss Abramson says, do the development factors, well, are there development factors in this case that, in your opinion, were relevant to the behavior of Erik Menendez during the last week before his parents were killed? Yes. And without getting into the details now, are those factors, in your opinion, connected to a concept called learned helplessness? Yes. Anyways, the witness says yes. And is learned helplessness a feature based on the literature, research, and clinical experience of people who are the victims of domestic violence and child abuse? Yes. So there's learned helplessness. Remember, this has been talked about in many times in this trial and in the first trial, how Erik, basically the parents uh, raised them so that they were completely helpless and dependent on the parents. I'm not going to say completely helpless, like they can do some things on their own, but obviously, but like most of little things you do in life, they couldn't do because parents did everything for them. So this learned helplessness is a feature that is important in this case in particular because Erik that didn't give Erik the, being having this learned helplessness, he could not escape. He didn't think he could leave the terrible situation that he was in. Does learned helplessness have any connection to the failure of people in abusive relationships to leave those relationships, to extricate themselves from it? See? He says, yes, it does. Does it have relevance to the failure of both adults and children to extricate themselves from abusive environments? Yes. Does learned helplessness involve issues of, well, tell me, what issues of the person are involved in the concept of helplessness? The witness says, the issues of or that are involved in the concept of learned helplessness include the fact that the person often doesn't see that anything that they do will produce an effect in their environment. That is to say, by taking actions one way or the other, by trying to affect an outcome, by trying to change a situation, to look at alternative solutions, someone who has learned helplessness thinks it doesn't matter what they do, it won't change things. That's part of the learned helplessness, that their responses don't produce an effect on the environment that's going to change it. So, what tends to happen in learned helplessness is that people stop responding in ways that could produce change. They give up, they surrender, they withdraw, they quit, they stop trying to look for alternative ways to have alternative outcomes for themselves, to solve problems, to change relationships, to change behaviors. That's part of what we mean by learned helplessness. It's a set of thoughts, it's a set of feelings, it's a set of motivations and behaviors that has at its core the sense for the person that no matter what I do, it's not going to make a difference. And that's because of all the threats and the things where, Jose would say, well, if you ever tell anybody about this, I'll kill you. If you ever tell anybody about this, I'm going to kill that person. If you ever, whatever, whatever kind of thing that Erik wanted to escape from, he knew he couldn't because it was always his father could always control the situation and come back to that. And father had control. Erik was eh, basically groomed to coalesce, to do whatever, to obey Jose at any given moment, anytime Jose asked for anything. So you just knew Jose was in charge and you didn't go against him. Then there was severe consequences if you did. So, yeah, that's an important piece to this learned helplessness that causes one to feel like they can't escape. Does that have any connection to an aspect of an abusive relationship? Abusive, strike that. Does that have anything to do, strike that? Does learned helplessness depend upon being in a relationship with an abuser who is also controlling, domineering, and powerful? Yes. Is power a significant part of all chronic abusive relationships? Yes. It's always about power and control. And you'll never win. If you try to argue with them, you won't win. And who has the power in chronic abusive relationships? The abuser. So that would be Jose and Kitty in this situation. Is that true in the battered wife cases and case histories that you're familiar with? Yes. As well as the abused children? Yes. With respect to parent child relationships, when you're talking about children of school age or younger, typically, who has the power in those relationships? The parents do. And is that true of good, benign, loving parents as well as bad, tyrannical, cruel ones? Yes. Now, we were talking a moment, sorry, about developmental issues. Does learned helplessness, the effects of learned helplessness, what is that? Strike that. We're talking about maturity, developmental maturity, okay? Yes. Does developmental maturity have any relationship to notions of helplessness or learned helplessness? Yes. What is that relationship? The relationship is that development maturity really refers to a progression of maturity, psychological maturity, emotional maturity, intellectual maturity, interpersonal, as a set of competency and skills that acquire in the course of a normal healthy development. The relationship of learned helplessness is where an individual develops learned helplessness. It begins to impair the natural progression of healthy maturation and development in all areas in terms of emotional development in terms of emotional development, intellectual, social, interpersonal, and areas of competency and so forth. Well, if a child is repeatedly traumatized over the course of their life, do their developmental needs go unfulfilled? Yes. So if Erik or Lyle have been repeatedly traumatized over the course of their life, developmental needs are not being fulfilled. What does that mean? Does their ability to mature, is the ability to mature interfered with if a child is, say, suffering from PTSD? Yes. Why does having an anxiety disorder like PTSD interfere with a child's growing up? That's what we mean by maturity, isn't it? Growing up? Yes. Why does it interfere with it? To say very simply that the anxiety interferes with the child being able to do what they're supposed to do at the right age at the right time, and that's because they're preoccupied with what's bothering them, with what's making them anxious. Or if they're traumatized, or we're talking about in PTSD, their attention is shifting to what it is that's happened to them. Their attention, their emotions, their behaviors are now directed towards that anxiety, that tension, that conflict that they've experienced because of the trauma. See, when that occurs, no matter where they are in the process of psychosocial maturity, the presence of that trauma and its aftermath now is impacting directly on whatever developmental stage they're at. So, wherever you're at developmentally, that trauma is going to affect it. And if you're obviously, if the trauma starts happening when you're 8, then that's where it's going to start affecting your developmental stages. And that is when Erik was they began to start Jose began the at least the sexual touching and the sexual assaults and whatnot. Um, but verbal abuse and things like that, that probably was going on long before that. So I don't know. Um, he continues on saying whether they're 2 or 10 or 16, it can affect them. Whatever age you're at, it's going to start affecting it at that age. So it interferes with the ability to have a normal resolution of the developmental task. Is one of the early developmental tasks learning trust? It's the primary developmental task. So trust is the number one thing that a child learns with its caretaker. There was a weird noise that I just heard in the house. I don't know what that was. Anyways, um, ghost or critter? I don't know. Uh, it sounded like a little scurrying, like I don't know, or it could have been like a piece of paper falling. I don't know. Anyways, the dogs are right here, so I don't know what that was. It was a little creepy. I forgot what I was saying. Earliest developmental stages. So the first thing that you develop as a child is trust in your caretaker. And if you don't have a caretaker that's trustworthy or that's going to put you in harm's way consistently or repeatedly, like Kitty did, or if you're going to have a caretaker who only likes you conditionally if you provide or do the things that he wants, then you're definitely not going to develop that trust in a healthy way. Miss Abramson asks, how would you describe the task of trust? Trust for whom? Trust in what situations? Trust refers to the first and most critical development stage in human development, and that's to establish a basic sense of trust in the care providers, the parents, or whoever has that responsibility to learn that the world is safe and a predictable place, and uh, and that needs will be met. That needs will be met, so that his needs or the child's needs will be met. That was just a weird way of saying it. That comfort and nurturance will be provided, that there's protection from harm, and eventually to learn that one can trust oneself as well as others. So you learn to trust yourself when you have a supportive parent who encourages your development, whereas in their situation, they didn't really have that. The only development they encouraged was in tennis or sports. That was about it. They did their homework for the brothers, so they didn't care about that. They just cared about appearances. That was the two things they needed to do. Be good at sports and don't make the family look bad. That was it. Those were the only real rules other than, I mean, you had to do everything that Jose said, but you know what I mean? Like on the outside, very tangentially, that's what was required of them. Don't make the family look bad. Sorry. So the answer was the trust refers to the first and most critical developmental stage in human development, and that's to establish a basic sense of trust in the care providers, the parents, or whoever has that responsibility to learn that the world is a safe and predictable place, that needs will be met, that comfort and nurturance will be provided, that there's protection from harm, and eventually to learn that one can trust oneself and others as well. That's really sort of the gain of the first year of life. Now, that same developmental primary task of trust versus mistrust also carries over to the second and third years of life, but it's the building block of all further human development and all further human mental health, and all further human developmental tasks perceived from there. Now, you have reviewed the testimony of Erik Menendez that he gave in this trial, have you not? I have. And you have noted his expressions of affection for his mother in particular? Yes. Is there information that was available to you that described the relationship between Erik Menendez and his mother when he was an infant and toddler? Yes. And from that information, did you form an opinion as to whether or not there was an attachment between Erik Menendez and his mother as an infant? Yes. And was there? Yes. Objection, says Mr. Khan. Irrelevant. Evidence Code, Section 352. The court says overruled. The answer will stand. Ms. Abramson says, and did there appear to be a at least somewhat nurturing environment by Mrs. Menendez towards Erik up till the time that he was about 2.5 or 3? Yes. From the information that's available to you, did her behavior towards him change? Yes. And did she direct nurturing love, affection, or any outward demonstration of that after that age? Objection, irrelevant. Evidence Code, Section 352. Court says overruled. The witness says yes. Sabinson says, and is there information from all the materials that you received that the only outward sign of affection that she ever directed towards Erik Menendez after the age of 3 was smiling? Objection leading and suggestive, says Mr. Khan. The court says also would call for a conclusion on the part of the witness sustained. Ms. Abramson says, was there evidence that after the age of 3 she was observed in her behavior towards him smiling? Objection calls for hearsay, says Mr. Khan. Sustained. This is garbage. Like, come on. They don't want anything in that can and in any way support the brothers testimony that there was abuse in the home. Pretty much anything that has any relation to that, they don't want it in. Like the smiling, and that's why he He did think smiling was a sign of affection because there wasn't a lot of affection in that house. That was the only affection that he got. Ms. Abramson says, is smiling a form of affectionate display, Dr. Wilson, generally? Yes. We'll strike that. Is it a typical way in which parents indicate to children that they feel positively towards them? Yes. Is screaming, yelling, throwing things, slapping, and hitting evidence of other feelings towards children? Objection, compound, and irrelevant, says Mr. Khan. The court says sustained. Ms. Abramson says, what kinds of behavior by parents are demonstration? What kinds of behavior by parents are demonstrations to a child of a non-loving? Huh? Objection, irrelevant, sustained. Did you, in reviewing the materials here, well, you've indicated to us that the background of environment here provided by Mrs. Menendez was one of non-nurturing, non-affection, non-support. Are we talking about with respect to Erik Menendez? What period after he was about or that period that he was about after 2.5, or 3 years old? Yes. And was that, in your opinion, all the way up until the time of the homicides? Correct. Now, we were talking earlier about behavior, psychological maltreatment under the category of terrorizing, and in assessing individual behaviors by either parent in this category as if of as it of any I'm sorry. Is it of any significance? God, my brain shuts down after a while. I'm sorry. Is it of any significance to keep in mind the background environment? He says yes. Were there specific things, in addition to that background environment, that Mrs. Menendez did with respect to Erik that fit the classification of acts that could instill fear, which is terrorizing? Yes. What do you recall are those specific acts? Objection, irrelevant, and Evidence Code Section 352. Sustained. Ms. Aronson says, Your Honor, we already had a ruling on this. The court says, well, is this going to be in conformity with what we had discussed? Yes, certainly, says Ms. Abramson. The court says, okay, overruled. Ms. Abramson says, in conformity with what we discussed, are there specific acts that you can point to by Mrs. Menendez that fit the category of psychological maltreatment, terrorizing? Yes. Can you tell us what they are? Well, there are a number of them. They include such things as driving recklessly, having Mr. Menendez in the car without a seatbelt, meaning Erik Menendez, not Jose, having Erik in the car without a seatbelt. When you say Mr. Menendez, do you mean Erik Menendez? Yes. And at that time that he's in a car without a seatbelt, is he a Mr. or a baby? Well, he was a child, yes. So is driving recklessly ordinarily considered driving abuse? No, not in and of itself. Well, why in this case is there something about the nature of the reckless driving here that does rise to that level? Sure, because he's the child in the car and he's not secured, and the reckless driving poses a danger to his well-being. Is this a one-time thing, this reckless driving with him in the car? No. How frequent is it? Very frequent. Is it character is it a driving pattern by Mrs. Menendez or an occasional reckless driving? Objection calls for a conclusion and speculation, says Mr. Khan. The court says you're asking, Ms. Abramson says, as it was directed to you by Mr. Menendez. The court says, all right, overruled. The witness says it was a consistent pattern. So according to Erik Menendez, her reckless driving when he was growing up in that household was a consistent pattern. Every day? Asks Ms. Abramson. He says, I don't know if it was every day, but it was reported to be frequent. Excuse me? I don't know if it was every day, every single day, but it was certainly frequent. It was a consistent pattern over time. Well, what do you mean? Or what did he describe by way of reckless driving? that she always was in a hurry to go someplace, to tennis practice, to school, that she'd drive quickly, would speed, would drive with great abandon to try to get where she was going. Ever lose control of the car? Yes, spun out. Had a spin out. Ever go off the road? I can't recall that one as I sit here. Drive on the wrong side of the road on purpose? Yes. Objection calls for speculation. Ms. Abramson says, in his perception, yes. The court says, whose perception? Erik Menendez's perception. The witness says, yes. So in Erik's perception, Mrs. Menendez, Kitty, did drive on the opposite side of the road intentionally on purpose. Ms. Abramson says, in trying to get somewhere fast, she'd drive on the wrong side of the road. Are you asking me? Yes. Yes, is his answer. Did he indicate to you that this frightened him? Yes. All the time. Yes. Now, was there another pattern of behavior on her part that frightened him? Yes. What was that? I would characterize it as an unpredictable rages in which she would scream and yell, clench her fists, clench her teeth, and yell at him, and sometimes throw objects such as dishes onto the floor or other objects in the house. This kind of behavior, while it seems like he's testifying that she did this to Erik, I believe Lyle got the brunt of this, screaming and yelling and clenched fists and teeth and throwing things constantly at Lyle and her telling him he ruined her life and things like that. So sad. Don't all parents get mad and yell? Asked Miss Abramson. I don't know if all parents do. Many do. Are they all being abusive? No. What was specific about these rages? What was specific about these rages is that they were directed at him. They were belittling. They were invective. They had, she said, derisive comments to him. Like negative comments. You're no good. I wish you wouldn't. You wouldn't have been born. You're the cause of my problems. These sort of things. Were they predictable? No. Were they based upon behavior on his part that he could control? No. Did he know what caused them? No. Was the significance of the unpredictability and his inability to control them? The significance is that he didn't know when his mother's going to go into a rage. He doesn't know when she's going to be reliable. He doesn't know when she's going to be available to him. And he doesn't know what the outcome's going to be, what's going to happen to him, or for that matter, what might happen to her in her own rage state. So what's going to happen to him? What might happen to her? What might happen to other people in the house when she's like that? People are scared. Does it frighten a child not to know what's going to happen to the parent? Yes. It makes them very anxious and uncertain about not only the parent, but the child's relationship to the parent as well. Did you receive any information that in this rage state she would throw things at him? Yes, I did. Or hit him? Yes. Or pull his hair? Yes. Or slap him? Yes. Or wrestle him? Yes. Or throw him into walls? Yes. Can you imagine throwing your little child into a wall? I can't. I can't. I can't. Anyways, moving on. It's too horrible to fathom what these brothers went through when they were young. When you talked about before learned helplessness, finding out that there's nothing you can do to change the environment, is the environment that people who are abused that they're trying to change or would like to change the scary environment? Indeed. And were these rages by Mrs. Menendez scary to Erik? Very much so. And the fact that he had no way to predict when they'd happen or do something that would avoid them, in your opinion, did that contribute to a sense of learned helplessness? Yes. Did you believe that he developed this psychological condition of learned helplessness over the course of his life with his parents? Yes. Was this one of the contributing factors his mother's unpredictable angers? Yes. Did he indicate to you that there were behaviors he engaged in to try to please her? Yes. And did some of those behaviors result in more anger? Yes. Is there a specific incident with respect to that you recall? Yes, I do. What is that incident? The incident that I recall, and this was on more than one occasion, is he tried to bake a cake for his mother to try to please her, and he indicated to me it didn't quite go well. Baking the cake didn't turn out perfectly, and when he came home or when she came home? Excuse me, when she came home, he was going to give her the cake, and she flew into a rage and berated him for trying to make a cake. Did he indicate to you that she threw the cake at him? She threw the cake at him. His efforts to please her turned into hostility on her part? Correct. Were there other specific incidents of behavior on her part, independent of anything her husband was doing, that was terrorizing? Yes. And what was that? There's several that he reported to me. One of them was locking him in a closet to do homework. This was characterized as a form of punishment for not being able to properly execute his homework. So he would be placed into a closet for varying lengths of time, anywhere from an hour to overnight, in which he was instructed to do his homework, and he was also given a plastic Tupperware type container in which to relieve himself if he had to go to the bathroom. Getting locked in the closet and a piece of Tupperware to use to relieve yourself. So he was isolated in his closet by his mother. And what's terrifying about that? First of all, he's being placed in a confined space with instructions that he can't leave. This is terrorizing because, first, it's a small space. Secondly, he's told not to leave with the threat of punishment. Thirdly, he's given a container to relieve himself, so it's humiliating and degrading. And fourthly, it's anxiety provoking because he doesn't know exactly how long he's going to be in there. There was variability about what the length of time was, so it would never be the same. Did he also indicate that there were days when he was in the closet and he was alone in the house? He was alone in the house, correct. Did he indicate he'd have fears of people breaking in and him not knowing about it and him not being able to deal with it? Yes. Poor Erik. Was it your understanding that this closet actually wasn't even locked? He could physically open the door? Yes, he reported to me it wasn't locked, but he came to learn his mother would place a paper in the crack, so if he opened the door, the paper would fall and she'd have a way of knowing that he got out of the closet. Did he indicate that he would stay in the closet? Yes. Out of fear of his mother? Yes. Now, was there anything just to lead you a little so that we don't take too much time, was there an episode that Erik described to you where his mother locked him out of the house in the middle of winter while he was up on the roof? Yes. This poor kid. Did he indicate how long he had remained locked out of the house on that roof? Objection calls for hearsay. The court says this is something related to you by the defendant, Erik Menendez. Is that correct? Yes, says the witness. Overruled, says the court. The witness says yes. How long did she lock him out? A minute? An hour? A day? It can be many hours. So it's not just one incident, it was often and it varied. With respect to one in particular time, did he indicate that he locked himself out on the roof all night? Yes. In the middle of winter? Yes. Now, did Erik Menendez describe for you in detail the series of repetitive, frightening nightmares that he had? Yes, he did. Did he relate to you that when he first started having one particular of these nightmares, he was afraid to go to sleep without checking his room for a monster figure from the closet from that nightmare? The monster, sorry, the monster from that nightmare? That's right. I thought they checked the closet. I don't know where he got closet from. Did he indicate to you that he had told his mother specifically about this nightmare? Yes. The green-faced monster. Yes. And that he had described it to her as a green-faced monster from the nightmare. That's correct. Did he then tell you about a behavior that his mother and father together participated in concerning this green-faced monster? This is horrible. Yes. What did he describe to you that they did? He described that they had placed a green mask in the closet and had asked him to check for the monster in the closet, and he went to check in the closet and opened the door, and the green-faced mask fell out. Who does that to their child? Was the direction to him to check for the mask in the closet as if it were reassuring? You go look, there's a mask in the closet? That kind of thing? That's correct. To say that there's no mask in the closet. Like, go ahead, just go look. There's no mask, like taunting him. Like, go ahead. There's nothing in there, knowing full well that it was. And then the mask fell out. That's right. Was it his mother who had told him, go look in the closet? Yes, it was. Did he indicate his father was in the hallway and started laughing when he started screaming? That's right. And is that a terrorizing behavior? It is. Does that type of behavior teach a child not to be afraid? No. What does that kind of behavior tend to do to children? Terrifies them. Do people get used to being afraid? No. Does being frightened over and over again make you harden to fear so that you don't get as frightened? No. Is the opposite true? Yes. So it's just reaffirming his fears when they do stuff like that, that it's possible that there might be a monster in the closet. Is the entire history of the research and PTSD based on that understanding? The fear response intensifies over time. So if you're frightened a lot, you're more frightenable? Yes. You don't get tough. You don't get tough from being frightened a lot. That's correct. Was it a misunderstanding of that led to the ostracism of shell-shocked soldiers back in World War One? Yes, indeed, it was. And other soldiers since. Yes. Now, is it frightening and terrifying to children to be abandoned by parents in places like shopping malls? Sure. Is there information that you received that Kitty Menendez frequently abandoned Erik and Lyle in shopping malls? Objection calls for hearsay and irrelevant. Sustained. Come on. That's what we're talking about here, is the way that they parented, causing PTSD, so why can that not come in? Miss Abramson asks, did Erik tell you about his mother losing him in shopping malls and not coming to get him for hours? Yes. Objection, irrelevant. Evidence Code 352 overruled, says the court. The witness says yes. Miss Abramson says, did he tell you that frightened him? Yes. Did he tell you that on winter nights, after he had participated in sports practices and trainings, she would fail to pick him up for hours? Yes. While he was waiting alone in the dark? Yes. Was he afraid of the dark? Yes. Was a component of one of his repetitive nightmares, in fact, that he was on the roof of the house alone in the dark? Yes. Have you seen any photographs, Dr. Wilson, that depict a green fright mask that matches the description of the frightening mask that Erik Menendez described in his dreams? Yes, I have. Have you seen that photograph recently? Yes, I have. And is it your understanding that this is the mask that his parents put in his closet? Objection calls for hearsay and speculation. The court says sustained. Objection sustained. Ms. Abramson says, Your Honor, I have a small photograph that. The court says, have you shown it to the prosecution? Yeah, says Ms. Abramson. Mr. Khan says, I think we'll need a hearing concerning the foundation for this photograph. We've never seen this before. The court says, we'll do that at some point, not now. The attorneys, Abramson and Khan, confer. Mr. Khan says, why don't we deal with it at the appropriate time? Ms. Abramson says, the photograph that you're referring to, was that inside photo albums for photo albums? The court says, objection sustained to the question because it has no personal knowledge of his when and where it was taken. Ms. Abramson says, I'm not asking when, and the court says, it's irrelevant at this point. Ms. Abramson says, I'd like to be heard, Your Honor. Not now, says the court. He never wants to hear her. Ms. Abramson says, now, were you also, she says to the witness, now, were you also made aware by Erik Menendez that his mother participated in locking him in the basement so his father could scare him? Yes, that's sick. Did he indicate to you that he was also approximately 7 years old when that occurred? Yes. And is that the kind of behavior, locking a child in a dark basement and then making scary noises, that's going to make that child courageous and brave and tough? No, it's not. What's it going to do? It's going to terrify the child, which is the whole point. That's all they wanted to do was terrify Erik. Now, with respect to children who are in their teens, can they also be terrified and frightened by parental behavior? Even teenagers. Yes, he says. Is that threat of the parent's suicide something that frightens a child? Yes. And do you have information in this case that Mrs. Menendez left a letter around while Mrs. Menendez wrote a letter that Erik Menendez found in which she was threatening to take her own life? Yes. And do you understand the timing of when the letter was discovered by Erik? I'm not sure what you're asking. All right. You are aware that the family moved to California from Princeton, New Jersey? That's correct. Are you aware that in the course of that move, Erik was separated from his brother Lyle? Yes. Are you aware that at the time there was no family, no relations of Erik's in California that he knew? Yes. Are you aware that he was left or that he left his friends behind? Yes. From the tennis team? Yes. Are you aware that he knew no one here when he moved here with his parents? That's correct. Are you aware that shortly after the move, there was a discovery by Mrs. Menendez that her husband had been having a 6 or 8-year affair? Yes. And that caused severe psychological problems for her? Correct. That she became extremely depressed? That's right. That she locked herself in her room and cried for weeks on end and ignored Erik completely? Yes. Is that milieu of a kid who's come from another place, who has no connections in the area, and whose mother is now obviously miserable, is finding a letter to take her own life from that parent a significant event? Absolutely. What does it cause typically? It causes a number of things in the context of this situation. First and foremost, fear. Fear that the mother actually will take her own life and abandon the kids and abandon his care. Secondly, it causes tremendous anxiety and understanding or uncertainty when she might actually commit like what time she might actually do it. So it causes an increase in vigilance, hypervigilance about their behaviors, her behaviors. What is she going to do next? It also leaves the child feeling like there's nowhere to turn in a sense. If your mother is going to take her own life and you don't have your brother and don't have your family and you don't have friends, where do you go? It heightens the sense of isolation and loneliness. Does it also cause the child to think negatively about themselves since their mother will leave them? Yes, yes, it's very common for children in this kind of situation to blame themselves and ask the question, what did I do to cause my parent to want to commit their or take their own lives? So, do children, by the way, just to change the subject straightly, children are who are wholly sexually molested by a parent, incest victims, they tend to blame themselves? Yes. Mr. Khan says, objection, irrelevant if it's not case specific. Overruled. The answer is yes. Ms. Abramson says, why is it that children blame themselves for parental misbehavior? How is that understood? It's understood in a number of ways. In terms of childhood abuse and sexual abuse in particular, one is that the perpetrator typically ensnares the child. They trap them by saying, first of all, by generating threats that if you tell such and such is going to happen, like I'll kill you. I'll kill myself. You'll lose me. Your mom's going to have to hold on. Your mom's going to have to go away. All have to go away. A whole range of specific threats that the perpetrator inflicts upon the child. That's first and foremost, I think. Secondly, there's a confusion and blurring of the boundaries, and that is that the child often is told that the abusive act, the sexual abuse, the hitting, emotional abuse, really is a form of love and a demonstration of affection by the parent. So there's a kind of reversing what is thought to be appropriate and inappropriate through confusion of the child. So it's almost like teaching them too, like what is appropriate affection between a parent and child and what isn't. It's teaching them the opposite. He says, let me just stop you. He finishes, let me finish the third thing here because it relates to that one. The third thing is also there's a kind of reversal of roles in which the child moves to feel that they're responsible for taking care of the parent or the person that's abusing them, that they have to meet the needs of that person. They have to love them and be affectionate towards them and be responsible for them. So the combination of the threat, the blurring of the boundaries about love equaling sex and affection or abuse equaling love and sex and affection and so on, that blurring of those kinds of boundaries, and then coupled with the kind of role reversal traps the child so that they begin to feel they're responsible. So they begin to feel that if something goes wrong, if a mother tries to commit, self unaliving or something happens, it's their fault. They feel shame. They feel blame. They feel it must be something that I did that caused this consequence. Is this particular family, if hypothetically the mother frequently told her two sons, you're the cause of all my problems, I'm the one who's suffering, in this family, if I hadn't had you, I would have had a better life. You have ruined my marriage. I wish you had never been born. And then leaves a note about taking her own life. Is that the kind of situation that likely would lead the child to blame himself? Yes. Objection calls for speculation. Overruled. The answer is yes. Miss Abramson says, and if a person blames themselves for all the bad things that are happening to them, are they less likely to take any constructive action to extricate themselves from the situation? Sure, they won't. Are they less likely to experience anger at the people who are abusing them if they believe it's their fault? Objection vague as to who is they and calls for speculation. Court says sustained as to the form of the question. Ms. Abramson says, okay, so we're talking about abused children in particular. In the studies and in the research, do abused children demonstrate or report anger at their abusers typically? Overruled, irrelevant, unless it's case specific. I'm sorry, just say overrule. I said it. I mean objection, and that objection is overruled. The witness says they typically don't express anger towards the parent, although they express anger. We must make that distinction. They don't express it, but they have it. They tend to suppress the anger that they have. Miss Abramson says, and suppress it from therapists or suppress it in their life. Both. How do you suppress it in life? If you feel angry, do you feel angry? When you say experience, do you mean feel or not feel but have it? It can be all of the above. If something is bad is done to someone, do they necessarily feel anger? If something bad is done to someone, do they necessarily feel anger? No. Does the anger never Is it anger when your person is violated instinctively? Does the organism react with anger? Yes. In people who are being routinely abused, is there a tendency to suppress feeling the anger? That's correct. Is there a tendency to suppress feeling the anger because they cannot act on it? Yes. What ways can they not act on anger that's generated by abuse? They can't act on the anger because, number one, they often have the sense that if they act on it, something terrible happens to them. That's part of the history of the abuse for children who have one form of abuse or another. In, in other words, asked Ms. Abramson, if they get angry at the abuser, yeah, if they get angry at the abuser, they're likely to get more abused. So the message is very simple. If you get angry, you're going to get punished or further abused. So the person learns not to express the anger, and if it's repetitive, they learn not to feel the anger. They literally suppress their own feelings about the anger. They're more likely to feel guilt or shame or embarrassment or humiliation. Now, when you say the anger's there, anyway, how does it manifest itself? How does it manifest itself? It can manifest itself in lots of different ways, depending on the age of the child. In young children, what ways? Objection, irrelevant, evidence, code, code section 352, and the court sustains it. Ms. Abramson says, are patterns that are established in, you're talking about, strike that. Are patterns that are established in people as young children persist into the adolescent years? Yes. So you continue to bring it on with you into later years if you don't resolve it. If they're in an environment with a dangerous, abusive person and they've learned to suppress their anger, does that become a habit and a pattern? Yes. So that even though they're re injured in the future, they don't act with anger. Yes. They learn to not even feel it. Yes. Is this also true and observed in battered women? Yes. Mr. Khan says objection, motion to strike, irrelevant. Court says overruled, the answer will stand. Ms. Abramson says, is one of the treatment goals of clinicians, therapists such as yourself, with people who have been abused or children or battered relationships to try to help those people express and feel anger towards their abusers? Yes, it is. Is it often a very ridiculous task to get them in touch with those feelings? It's very difficult. Let's go back for a moment to circus. I'm sorry, to circus. My cursor was on there, and that's what it looked like, a circus, and my eyes are tired. I need coffee. Hold on. Is it often a very difficult task to get them to touch with those feelings, to get them in touch with the feelings? It is very difficult, says the witness. Well, let's go back for a moment to cues. Gone down a pathway here. Going back. Mr. Khan says objection, motion to strike, counsel's comment to the jury. The court says, just ask the next question, please. Like, why are you objecting to this, you dumbass? Like, really? It takes more time for you to object to it than for her to say it and move on. You know what I'm saying? And it's just stupid. He keeps doing that with like these little things that she says that aren't even like worth mentioning. Miss Abramson says, were there particular behaviors and words and actions by Mr. Menendez that Erik Menendez reported to you that served as cues to potentially dangerous behavior on her part? Mrs. Menendez. He says yes. Can you recall some of those things? Sure. There are a number of different ones. One, of course, had to do with her unpredictable yelling and screaming. That was a cue that she was in a state of distress, that she was upset. Another cue for him were changes in her behavior that he associated with her alcohol consumption or drug taking. By drug taking, I mean prescribed medications that she had been given. And those cues were things like slurred speech, being non responsive, and being sarcastic in her tone of voice, and those were cues that she was in a state of distress or intoxication. There were other cues as well, nonverbal cues that she would have clenching her fists, making faces, having blood veins bulge in her face were indicative of states of extreme hostility and anger. These are the other types of cues. There were others as well that were a cue to Mr. Menendez about her state, and in particular, the hurry, what I call the hurry cues, her rushing to leave the house, to take him to school, to pick him up to go somewhere, was another cue of her being agitated. And when she was agitated, she was much more likely to be hostile, angry, belittling, and accusatory of him. And another cue associated with that, rushing and hurrying for Erik Menendez, was that she would become forgetful. And the significance of her forgetfulness is if she forgot, for example, his tennis rackets, she would make him own the responsibility for her mistake and then report it to his father. What a bitch. Oh dear, I forgot your tennis rackets, but you're gonna tell your abusive father that you're the one that forgot them. Okay? Okay. Who does that to their kid? Which meant that he would get punished by his father. Well, yeah, of course he would get punished because his mother would tell on him, and this wasn't even something he did. This was one of those things that he testified to, that, he always had his mother like watching him or having dad's back. So anytime dad wasn't around, she played the part of dad. She was going to be dad's eyes and ears every time they were out and about and he was doing his tennis and whatnot. So made him fearful of her too, because she would tell dad everything. So he had a heightened sensitivity to times when she would be in a hurry, because it signaled that she might not only might she drive too fast, she might forget things, which would lead to a sequence of events that would have punishing consequences for him. So anytime there was this hurrying, it was usually meant they were late or something, and she was rushed and having anxiety, and you putting that anxiety on him and making him have anxiety, and then therefore he'd also get the punishments that came along with whatever she was being forgetful about. Not really a fair deal. So uh, poor Erik. I just have to say, like, out of that whole family, he got it the worst, man. Now, with respect to Mr. Menendez, you've talked about the most significant traumatic events of Erik Menendez's life were the sexual molestation events of different character. Correct. There were several different types, correct? Yes. Were there also other behaviors specific in general by Mr. Menendez? Specific in general, no, that's the opposite. Were there other behaviors specific in general by Mr. Menendez that constituted traumatic stress? Yes. Let's focus on a moment on corporeal punishment. hmm Is it always child abuse to hit a child with a belt? Objection, improper expert opinion. The court says rephrase the question. Ms. Abramson says, based on the common acceptance now in the psychological community about what constitutes male maltreatment, is hitting a child with a belt necessarily always child abuse? Objection, improper expert opinion. The court says, sorry, we have a chair outside and it's rocking in the wind, and that's what I was hearing. I didn't know what that was. Objection, improper expert opinion. The court says, this is your personal opinion. For it, you can answer the question. The witness says, if I understand the question, you're asking me, is it always, Ms. Abramson says yes, determined by the community that hitting a child with a belt is a form of child abuse? Yes. The witness says yes. Ms. Abramson says, was it always so? No. And in the past, was spare the rod, spoil the child a commonly accepted notion? Objection, irrelevant. Sustained. Were there, however, always a common acceptance that a certain kind of use of physical force was abusive? Objection, leading and suggestive. Overruled. The witness says yes. Ms. Emerson says, now, are you aware of the description of how Jose Menendez would use both the actual infliction of strappings with a belt and the threat of the use of that belt? Yes. And was the way in which he utilized a belt both for threat, for fear, and for punishment, in your opinion, abusive even in the 70s? Objection, improper expert opinion. Overruled, says the court. Yes, it was. Because it was ritualistic in form and it had a specific sequence of events to it that had different components as part of what I'm referring to as being ritualistic. I go back to my previous comment where I said I think he might be in some kind of group, some kind of um maybe a he has an inside connection to some higher up people. Think about the Schmepstein files and think about this ritualistic thing that he's talking about. It was ritualistic in form. It had a sequence of events. Number one, he would require Erik Menendez to keep the belt in his closet, to be hung in a particular place, and if the belt were moved, that would constitute a transgression that would lead to punishment. Number two, there were many occasions in which he would remove his belt from his waistline and snap it loudly with intimidating gestures to Erik, and that was a cue. You mean Erik when you're talking about, I'm referring to Erik because he said Mr. Yeah, okay. She says, refer to him as Erik Menendez. Fine, I'll refer to him as Erik Menendez. Fine, thank you. He says, so that was a cue to Erik Menendez that he could be punished or would be punished. And then thirdly, when the punishment was inflicted, he would hit with a belt on his legs and his buttocks in ways that would leave bruises. So the context of the use of the belt was not simply as punishment for a wrongdoing, a breaking of the rule, or a transgression. It had this other element of ritualistic, anxiety-inducing terror and in pain as well. So he used the belt for the purposes of terrorizing Erik. Was there also information that the belt could just be left on a table and Erik seeing it there would be terrified even if it wasn't used? Yes. Was there also information that when he was whipped with a belt, he was alone and isolated and no one was able to come to comfort him? Correct. You've indicated that you reviewed Erik Menendez's testimony in which he reported certain episodes of physical assault by his father. Yes. Being pushed through a plate glass window? Correct. Being assaulted on the tennis court? Yes. And of course, the behavior with sharp objects that occurred during some of the sexual acts? Yes. And she forgot him holding a knife to his throat also. Without having to repeat them, are those terrifying activities? Absolutely. So they don't have to be a repetitive thing, just once in and of itself is enough. Was the father's demeanor, the way he talked to Erik Menendez, the way he looked at him, also terrifying, even if it's not accompanied by physical assault? Yes. Is there a particular word that sums up how Mr. Menendez presented himself towards Erik Menendez? Domineering. How about intimidating? Was there evidence of being intimidating? Objection leading. Overruled. The witness says yes. Domineering, intimidating. So he was intimidating. Based on all the information you have, intimidating behavior, a frequent expression by Mr. Menendez towards his son. Yes. Was it a way in which many people, in fact, described Jose Menendez? Yes. As an intimidating person. Objection calls for hearsay. Sustained. The answer stricken. The previous answer is stricken as well. It's obvious. It's obvious. Mrs. Abramson says, I would object to the court striking answers to which the people have not objected. The court says, fine, your objection is overruled. I mean, he's not supposed to. You're only supposed to strike if you feel that it's necessary to strike an answer that has been objected to. You don't just strike testimony. I mean, I guess you could if something really egregious came in that was already agreed upon ahead of time not to come in, but not in this case. Ms. Abramson says, I would ask the bailiffs to see if the juror needs help. The court says, are you okay? Juror number 1 says, I will be in a second. The court says, okay. Ms. Abramson says, are children easy to intimidate? Yes. Are they particularly easy to intimidate by people whose intention it is to intimidate them? So if you have a predator preying on a child, is that, are they easily susceptible? Yes. Is it intimidating to a child to see their parents intimidate other people who could be supportive towards that child, like an aunt or an uncle who maybe at one time said something and stood up for them, but got reamed out for it by Jose? Yes. The answer is yes by the witness. So, for instance, if a child has a good relationship with teachers but observes the parents intimidating the teachers, is that frightening to the child? Sure. And are you aware of situations in which Erik Menendez observed his parents intimidating his teachers? I am. Did Erik Menendez report to you that over the entire course of his life, he never saw anyone stand up to his father and stick around? He didn't. And could he, in fact, only remember one person ever standing up to his father, and that being a coach? Yes. And that coach was fired? Correct. Did Erik Menendez report to you an incident where his father had him repeatedly jumped into his arms and then his father purposely failed to catch him? Yes. And in fact, made a comment to him? Yes. And what was the comment as reported to you? Comment was that you have to learn you can't even trust your father. And is that a healthy lesson? No. Is that the kind of thing that terrifies a child? Yes. Did you receive information from Eric Menendez about what his father would do to him at very young age, 5, 6, in swimming pools under the guise of training? Yes. And did that information, well, what did that information have to do with briefly? The information had to do with a number of things, actually, but at that specific age, it had to do with breath training, as he reported it to me, that his father would hold him underwater and ask him to hold his breath, and he would hold him for what Eric perceived to be a long period of time where he was losing his breath. And then his father would pull him up and then push him back down again and repeat that action over and over again. And Eric said to me he actually said to me that he thought he was going to die because he had such a hard time getting his breath. It was explained to him in this context that this was learned how to get breath control in swimming. This was how you learned how to get breath control. Did Eric indicate to you that he thought at that age that his father was going to kill him by accident? Yes. Not realizing. Mr. Khan says, I would object at this point and ask that counsel be instructed to refer to the witness by his proper name. Yes, says the court. Ms. Abramson says, did he indicate that he felt that his father might inadvertently kill him by accident? Yes. Does fear that a parent might, through neglect or accident, kill you nevertheless create a state of stress or anxiety for a child? Yes. It isn't just fear of intentional death. Objection leaning. Sustained. Ms. Abramson says, is it only fear of intentional death that creates a state of anxiety for that child? No. Were there other aspects? Well, just one other thing. You also are aware of an incident where Mr. Menendez purposely abandoned Eric Menendez in a cemetery when he was quite young so that Jose could frighten the child. Yes. Is that the kind of thing that likely to increase a child's anxiety? It sure is. Could you imagine putting your kid in a cemetery just to scare them? That's terrifying. That's horrible. Ms. Abramson says, Your Honor, I'd like to approach because there's an incident I'd like to elicit from the witness, and I'd like the court's permission. The court says, let's go on to something else. You have 12 minutes to go here. Ms. Abramson says, all right. I'll mark it as I'll come back next week. Do young children take the threats of parents seriously? Yes, of course. Particularly if they're death threats? Sure. Now, is there a difference between a parent who's angry and upset, saying, you do that again and I'll kill you, and a real death threat? Yes. What determines the difference? What determines the difference is a number of things. Clearly, some parents get so frustrated they say, you do that again, I'll kill you. You don't really mean it. They're feeling frustrated and they want to correct the problem. The difference when someone says, you do that again and I'll kill you, is the tone of voice, the demeanor, the seriousness in which the parent is saying it, and whether or not they do other things to suggest that they'll follow through with it. Whether they're otherwise cruel? Yes. With respect to the threats that Eric Menendez reports his father made concerning what he would do to him if he screamed again or cried out again during violent sex, are those the kinds of threats that a child would take seriously? Yes. Particularly, is that especially true if the threats are accompanied by physical assault, like being smacked in the face? Yes. And we'll strike that. With respect to children in incest relationships, are threats concerning punishment or death of the child typically made by incest perpetrators in order to ensure the child's silence? Yes. And are those kinds of threats more likely to occur as the child gets older than when they're quite young? Yes. Is it easier to control a young child without having to threaten to kill them? Yes, it is. And as children get older, is it reported in the literature that as incest victims get older, their abusers tend to increase the level of threat and the efforts to control because they fear the child might be more likely as they get older to report? Mr. Khan says, I would object is irrelevant as to what happens in other cases. The court says, sustained. But this is a guy who is an expert in this stuff. He's not just making this stuff up. Other cases are what set the precedent, right? Ms. Abramson says, is that a pattern that you detected here? Court says, why don't you rephrase it to the question so that the question has some meaning? She says, okay. With respect to the literature concerning children living in abusive relationships within the home, is there an escalating pattern that's been noted of fear-inducing behavior by the abusers? Objection irrelevant. Sustained. So annoying. Samerson says, I don't understand the objection, Your Honor. Maybe I'm tired. I'll go on to something else and I'll come back to this. In the literature of incest, does there appear to be generally accepted within the research community the notion that incest perpetrators often go through a period of so-called grooming of the victim child to gain their compliance for the sexual demands? Objection irrelevant. Sustained. So that's how it's going to be, Judge. Every time she tries to get into what happens in incestuous family relationships, every time it's going to be an objection and a sustained, I betcha. Ms. Amerson says, well, Your Honor, I'd like to be heard. The court says, we'll discuss that as well. Something else. Ms. Amerson says, was Erik Menendez groomed for sex by his father, in your opinion? Objection vague. Sustained. Is the term grooming for sex an accepted concept in the child sexual molestation incest literature? Objection irrelevant. Sustained. Your next question. She can't even get into this? This is ridiculous. Ms. Abramson says, based on the incest literature, do incest perpetrators usually start out with the R word, or do they start out with other behaviors calculated to gain the child's cooperation? Objection, irrelevant, sustained. Why don't you go on to something else? Ms. Abramson says, I'd like to understand what's going on once in a while. Because he keeps objecting to things and she doesn't know why that they're getting sustained. Mr. Khan says, I'd ask that counsels. The court says, what was that remark? Ms. Abramson says, I said I'd like to understand what's going on. The court says, normally that happens when we have a discussion outside the presence of the jury. If you're requesting one, we'll do that at the appropriate time. I did, says Ms. Abramson. He says, your next question, please. So again, he's denying her a sidebar or to send the jury out, yet and he's not letting her get into the question. So what the F, Judge? Samerson says, did it enter into the formation of your opinion concerning Erik Menendez's state of mind at the time that he participated in killing his parents that the degree to which he had developed symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder was also dependent on his having been isolated as a child? Yes. What kinds of behaviors by a parent in general result in isolation of a child? Objection irrelevant unless it's case specific. Sustained. Ms. Abramson says, what kinds of behaviors by these parents resulted in isolating Erik Menendez? There were a number of different types of behaviors by the parents of Erik Menendez that resulted in isolation. One was the disencouragement of having friends, that Erik was told specifically by his father, as he reported it to me, that having friends, whether or not they might turn on you or whether or not you could count on them, so it was better not to have friends. Two, the parents totally controlled Erik's schedule. They controlled his school schedule, his sports schedule. Every day was structured, and the result of the control was to basically limit the types of contact that he could establish freely on his own. That is to say, to limit how much Erik had latitude or freedom or discretion or encouragement for that matter to go and make friendships, to invite kids to his house, to go over to other people's houses, to do those sorts of things that would build a network of friends. So that's a second major component. A third one related to that was the act of discouragement by the parents of having friends come to the house, to visit the house, to play at the house, to have a meal with his family, to stay overnight. Those kinds of things were actively controlled and actively discouraged by both the parents. And the fourth thing related to this kind of isolation is that the court says it's Erik Menendez. The witness says Erik Menendez, correct. Ms. Abramson says, you have to use both first and last. He says, I'm sorry, Your Honor. Court says, everybody here, we talk to you as Dr. Wilson, Ms. Abramson. When we talk to people on the jury, we refer to them as their last and first in the same way. The witness says, I'm happy to comply. Yes, sir, I'll do that. Thank you. A fourth area with respect to Erik Menendez was not only was he not encouraged to have friends over at the house, but there was a rule of secretiveness in the house that others weren't to find out that he was how he was doing in school, what grades he was getting, what kind of performance he had in tennis, how well the family whatever area it was that with respect to Erik Menendez performance or school life or friends, that was to be protected and guarded. And the consequence of that is another form of isolating Erik Menendez from others that were important to him in his life at the time. So those are sort of four major areas, and there are others as well. Were you aware of the fact that there were relatives of the family living in New Jersey near where they were living for most of their formative years? Yes. Did you receive information concerning the type, duration, and extent of interaction that was permitted with those relatives? Yes, I did. What did that indicate, if anything, on the issue of isolation? There was even limited contact with the family, even though they lived in proximity to other relatives as well. When you indicate there were rules of secretiveness, that he was not supposed to tell how he was doing in school, etc., who was he not supposed to tell? Everybody, including his relatives. Was the fact that, well, is it considered isolating as another form of psychological maltreatment of children? Is it not? Yes, it is. Is it considered isolating when the child's problems, like learning disabilities, are never told to him or discussed with him? Yes. Did that happen in this case? Yes, it did. That he never told that he was never told that he had learning disabilities? Correct. Why is that isolating? Objection, irrelevant, Evidence Code, Section 352. Court says sustained. Ms. Abramson says, is the fact that, in your opinion, Erik Menendez was isolated bear on the severity with which he developed PTSD symptoms? Yes. Is that part of whether there is a support system or a lack of support system that can ameliorate the onset of those symptoms? That's correct. So it isn't just within the immediate family that you look for the support system, but wider. That's correct. Was he isolated from being able to seek help from coaches and teachers? Yes. Now, there were many, many grown-ups who passed through his life during his formative years in the form of coaches and teachers, correct? That's correct. What kept him from getting support, if anything, from those people? Basically, what kept him from getting support from the coaches and teachers was that the parents were always involved in every aspect of Erik Menendez's activity. So, whenever it was tennis, going to school, or any other activity, it was the parents that dictated the schedule. They frequently attended the tennis practices, the tennis matches. They went to school to pick him up. They went to school to have the conferences with the teachers. So, the simplest way to say it, the parents were actively involved in controlling every aspect of what he did, so that the consequence is that he didn't have the freedom, he didn't have the degrees of freedom or the opportunity to establish those relationships on his own if he would have wanted to. Well, but what I'm saying is, why couldn't he go to a teacher and say, I'm being abused, help me? Because there were secrets in the family not to talk. not to tell what goes on in Erik Menendez's family. In reviewing all of Erik Menendez's school records, as you have, as an evaluator of post traumatic stress disorder and an evaluator of records that something's really wrong here? Yes. Do you have any evidence whatsoever that any teacher ever reached out to Erik Menendez to try, to even the ones who made these notations, to try to help him? Not one. They probably did, but got yelled at by Jose or Kitty, one or the other. Is there indications that any of the tennis coaches ever reached out to help? Yeah, there's some indication that one tennis coach did reach out. What happened to that coach? He got fired. That's why there were so many coaches, because Jose liked to boss around the coaches too, and he didn't want the coaches catching on to what was going on in the homes either. So there's that. Was there any indication in strike that you have reviewed? I would just want to, I think I want to end, if we can, just briefly here with, before we go on to any more details with the materials that you have reviewed and that you are relying on to support your opinions in this case, okay? And ask you, first of all, when you go about making an evaluation for court purposes, so-called forensic purposes, do you do more than just interview the participant in the litigation, in this case, Erik Menendez? Yes. Did you interview him? Yes. How many hours did you spend interviewing him? 30 and a half. Are you aware that he was also interviewed by other forensic experts in the mental health field? Yes. And in addition to Dr., you've indicated that you read the notes of Dr. Vickery? Yes. And you know that Dr. Vickery is someone who saw Erik Menendez over a period of 5 years? Yes. And you're aware that Erik Menendez was also seen and evaluated by Dr. Ann Burgess? Correct. And you're aware she testified the first time around? Yes. Are you aware of how many hours she spent with him? I don't recall. I think it was around 80. Are you aware that Erik Menendez was also evaluated and interviewed by a Dr. Ann Tyler? Correct. And she's an expert in psychological maltreatment? Yes. And do you have any idea of approximately how many hours she spent with him? I would have to guess. And she was a witness who testified in the first trial? Yes. Objection irrelevant. Overruled. The answer will stand. Did you read her testimony? The witness says, yes, I did, Your Honor. Ms. Abramson says, you read the testimony of all the expert witnesses who testified in the first trial. That's correct. Did you read the testimony of all the teachers who testified in that trial? I did. All the coaches? Yes. All the family members? Yes. And the friends of Mr. and Mrs. Menendez? Yes. All the friends of Erik and Lyle Menendez? Yes. Just to finish the forensic people, though, did you also, well, you said you consulted in preparation for your own testimony in this case with a Dr. Stuart Hart. Is that correct? Correct. Is it your understanding that Dr. Stuart Hart is also an expert in psychological maltreatment? Correct. Is it your understanding that Dr. Stuart Hart also interviewed Erik Menendez in this case? Yes. Now, in addition to materials concerning those expert witnesses, did you have provided to you the statements of witnesses in different categories? Yes. Teachers? Yes. Coaches? Yes. Family members? Yes. Friends of the parents? Yes. Friends of the sons? Yes. Business associates of the father? Yes. And that was people who both testified at the first trial and did not testify at the first trial. That's correct. Both groups. And with respect to those witnesses in the categories we just related to, who did testify at the first trial, did you also view the videotape of the testimony of those people? I did. Why did you view their videotapes? I wanted to see their demeanor. I wanted to see how they answered questions. I wanted to get a feel for them as human beings. I wanted to look at their effective responses to the questions that were being asked. I wanted to get some sense of their credibility and their honesty. I wanted to get some sense of their personal knowledge of the defendants and their personal information they had about Erik Menendez and his family. Those kinds of things were important to me. Now, did you also, in addition to information from experts and witnesses, did you also look at the scene photographs in this case? Yes, I have. And the autopsy photographs? Yes. And you were shown the autopsy reports? Yes. Was it also relayed to you, so you didn't have to read it all, what happened in the litigation in this trial concerning testimony about the scene and about the wounds and all of that? Yes. Did you also look at photographs of Erik and Lyle Menendez and their parents that were taken over the course of their childhood? Yes, I did. Did you see photographs of Erik and Lyle Menendez naked, with their heads not in the photograph? Yes. Did those photographs have any bearing on forming your opinions in this case? Yes. You've indicated you looked at all of Erik Menendez's school records. That's correct. Did you also have available to you and did you examine all of his medical records? Yes. Did you also have available to you and did you examine all of the records of Mrs. Menendez's therapies? Yes, I did. And did that include the records of a Dr. Cox? Yes. The records of a Dr. Summerfield? Yes. The records of a Dr. Emery? Correct. Did you also have police reports? Yes. Did you have statements that Erik Menendez and Lyle Menendez made to detectives to the Beverly Hills Police Department after the parents were killed? Yes. Hold on one second. Sorry, I just had a freak out moment thinking that the people who were working on the roof didn't close the gate and the dogs got loose and I was hearing bad things. So, anyways, let me back up to that question. They're fine. The gate's closed. Did you have statements that Erik Menendez and Lyle Menendez made to detectives of the Beverly Hills Police Department after the parents were killed? Yes. Did you also have a copy of what's been referred to here as the 1211 discussion with the Dr. Oziel? Yes. Now, are you basing the opinions that you have so far rendered and will render in the first of your testimony in this case solely on what Erik Menendez alone told you? No. When you do an evaluation of a person to determine whether or not they suffer from any mental disease, defect, or disorder, do you usually try to seek what's known as corroborating information? Yes. From people other than the person? Yes. Is that specifically true when it has to do with legal proceedings? That's correct. Is there anything else that I'm forgetting that I haven't mentioned? Yes, there is. There's one other area, and that is I reviewed the results of psychological testing that I conducted on Erik Menendez. How many different tests did you administer to him? 4 different tests. And what are those tests designed to measure? They're designed to measure PTSD symptomology. They're designed to measure psychiatric symptoms across a number of different psychiatric categories. They're designed to measure impact of traumatic experiences to the person's self-concept, their self-reference, their sense of identity, their sense of personhood. They also help to measure levels of distress when the context of the diagnosis of PTSD in its full form, including intrusive reliving avoidance tendencies, dissociation, depression, anxiety, hyperarousal, and those kinds of things. Did those tests contribute at all? Well, did you base your opinion on those tests? Did they contribute to your opinion? Did they just support or confirm your opinion? What, if anything? They both supported and confirmed my opinion. The tests indicate a positive diagnosis for PTSD. Ms. Abramson says, this is a good place. as any to stop, Your Honor. The court says, okay, let me just inquire, are you still feeling about the same? The juror says, yes, sir. The court says, we'll take our recess until Tuesday. Monday is a legal holiday. We'll resume Tuesday at 8:30. Must be President's Day or something. Don't discuss the matter with anyone. Don't form any final opinions about it, and we'll ask that you return so that we can resume Tuesday at 8:30. We'll see you back here at 1:30 counsel. So then they're going to have a lunch break, and counsel's going to come back and do some arguments, which we will save for the next episode. So that is the first half of Friday, January 2nd, 1996. We will continue with the second half is just going to be arguments because the jury's already been sent home. So we will, like I said, there's a lot of arguments between now and the end of this trial. A lot of arguments outside the presence of the jury because everything has become a battle. So we're going to read it all. So make sure you are subscribed. Please hit the like button, and I will see you guys in the next one. Thank you so much for watching. Take care. That's the end of this Trial Transcripts Exposed. Thanks for following along with me. Like if you want more, subscribe, and let me know what you think in the comments below. See you next time.